Hello, hello, hello. Welcome, everybody. Hello. How are you all doing? I apologize for the bit of OBS scuff that I had. Thank you for showing up to my very true and real pedagogy tier list. If you don't know what pedagogy is the study of teaching. And considering the school year has just started, I figured that'd be a pretty good place to start. Let me go ahead and make sure that the chat is accurate here. There we go. Welcome. Hello, everybody. Hello. Let me say hi to you all. Hello, Spepik, Nicholas, Marlon. Hello, welcome. Hair Day, Silly Cat Boy, Icosahedron, Mobo, Slipta, Kevin. Welcome. Yeah. So I had my semester start, and it's been going on for just a couple of days. And while the start for my personal semester was a little rocky, by Friday I've locked in and am more focused, and I'm happy and excited to teach this semester. And I thought it would be useful to learn a little bit about the research behind teaching. Teaching might often seem sort of a very personal and maybe even an artistic form of communication. I can definitely attest to the fact that I have had teachers where it did not seem that they had any sort of training, because that's how bad they were. But hopefully, I want to share that there's a lot that goes into a classroom, and we'll get to hear a little bit about what those things are. I want to start off with a couple of disclaimers, though. The first disclaimer being that, as any psychologist is very familiar with, the study of teaching is very messy, and I am not a professional psychologist, right? I am a teacher, so I have firsthand experience, but in terms of, being an authority, I would say that I think I'm pretty good, but I am always, of course, improving. But I don't have a very wide breadth and depth of knowledge of the teaching field as an academic discipline. So I will primarily be speaking about my own experiences, as well as bringing in some of the literature that I have been sort of casually reading. And actually what I've found is that a lot of the literature that I did read actually actually opposes sort of the teaching practices that I thought were being effective. So it's an interesting conversation to have as to what is useful and what isn't in a classroom. The other thing that I would like to make known is, of course, if you are watching my live, you already know I am a biology teacher, and so that is going to be my perspective, right? Some of the teaching techniques that I'm going to be talking about may be only effective or most effective in my discipline, so I wouldn't generalize to other classrooms. So one more disclaimer I want to make is GPA isn't everything, but it is my job to get the student on the other side of the desk to master as much of the content as possible, and then evaluate them on that mastery, which unfortunately does mean generating a number, aka the GPA, right? Grade point average. I want to make it very clear from the very start, just because your GPA is low doesn't mean you can't find success. It's just the scope of this conversation is going to be thinking about how to get a bigger number on your report card, right? So I want everybody to sort of understand where we are coming from in that regard. Well, to be fair, a lot of teachers/professors don't have any formal training in their education, just their corresponding subject. Exactly. There's a bit of an interesting incentive structure around university, at least in America, where a lot of parents who can afford to send their children to these expensive universities, or a lot of students who have to take loans out and go into debt to learn at these very expensive universities, again, in America, because that's how our education system is structured, they want to learn from the best in their respective fields. But sometimes, if you have a professor who is highly acclaimed in their own field of research, it doesn't necessarily mean that they are capable or want to be capable teachers. It just so happens to be the case that a lot of very high achieving research scientists also happen to have an interest in teaching, but it's not necessarily required of them. Learning from the best in the world can be very rewarding, but to set the expectations straight, there's not like a regular academy or a requirement to learn how to teach. So your mileage may vary when it comes to your classroom experiences. It looks like we have some interesting conversation going on in chat about whether or not standardized, the quality of standardized testing. It's also something that I'm going to be talking about later in the stream. So I want to do this tier list for you all, and I'm going to sort of go through the categories, and then I'm going to catch up on chat. So I'll do a couple, and then I'll take a little break, and then we'll have a discussion based on your experience. Because again, as much as I want to clickbait in my YouTube thumbnail and my title, I'm not an authority. This is just sort of my experience with teaching. All right. Hello, welcome to all of you who have come in. I don't think I've said hi to you, Sash Boo or Space Track, but welcome to the stream and the randomer. Okay, so let's get started with the first item, something that might be very appropriate to start with in the study or the understanding of student performance in class, and that would be cognition. So I am going to be defining cognition as very vaguely how good the brain work, right? Let me make sure that I can get this. How good the brain work, right? So this is sort of what people could potentially think of as IQ. Oh, what happened here? There we go. This is what people might think of as IQ, just like how well does your brain do the operations that are required to do academic work, right? And I'm actually going to put cognition at a B, which can be quite controversial. Let me explain myself here. So cognition, again, I'm not an expert in cognition, and I may be undervaluing cognition, admittedly, but in my classroom, in the classrooms that I have taught in, the absolute genius IQ stuff, I feel like isn't really that super duper important when it comes to achieving the number that you want to achieve on your report card, right? Certainly, it is helpful, I think, to have a brain that can do things like problem solving and memorization better. But often if we're talking about what you as a student can do in a classroom, thinking about cognition and the role that cognition plays in your grade, I think is actually not very productive, I'll say. Because by definition, cognition is important. You're using your brain in an academic setting. Of course, that usage is going to be important. But because I don't find that there's a lot of actionable advice or actionable tools built around sort of improving cognition, I tend to undervalue, or I don't know if I undervalue, I think I appropriately value, but I think people might think that I undervalue cognition as a construct. I think the perception, at least certainly in the very competitive environments that I grew up with, the perception of how important cognition is was very overblown and quite harmful. So for those of you who don't know, I grew up in a very, very academically competitive environment from when I was very young. And I always just felt like the people who were better than me were just built different, that there was some level of achievement that I could never breach because for one, my memory is actually very bad. My working memory, especially, if you tell me a phone number, I'm going to need a lot of time to memorize it. And I always felt that I was sort of not as capable as my peers because some things like memory appeared to just be hard-coded. I don't know if working memory can be expanded through various tricks and practices, but what I felt was that I had to work harder than my peers who were almost effortlessly achieving back when I was very young. And that was very harmful because it felt like it wasn't worth trying if I couldn't achieve at the level that I wanted to achieve, because it was defeatist to think that, oh, because I'm not built like a smart person, that I am never going to achieve like a smart person, which is why I do not want to put cognition too highly. Because this is more of a heavy, I think, concept, I'll go back and read a little bit what chat thinks. B for big brain. That's true. Welcome, Megatecraft. Yeah. Let's see. You're absolutely correct. Intelligence is only significant up to a certain point. Exactly. Like, I think that there are diminishing returns for this concept of cognition or being better at cognition. So I want, the general student to not overvalue sort of quote unquote being smart. Working memory capacity is heavily correlated with academic success. There are studies for learning to read or early maths, and working memory is very important for that. Sadly, you can't improve working memory. Yeah, so that's exactly why I am not saying that it's not important. What I am saying is that because there are certain things that you can and cannot change, cognition should not really be thought of as that important. Because this is my hot take, and I understand that this might be controversial, but I think, you know, we share the same species as Albert Einstein, right? We share the same species as Isaac Newton. Now, granted, most of us will not achieve that level of, you know, academic godhood, you could even call it. But the very fact is that most of us, you know, the overwhelming majority of us have a brain that is capable of doing complex actions. Evolution has selected for the ability to problem solve and to memorize, etc., etc. I think there is a lot more to achievement than just cognition, and so that's why cognition ends up in B. My working memory is horrible. Yeah, it's tough being a biologist with bad working memory. It really is, but you know, there are ways that you can overcome that downside, I should say. I compensated for memory with deduction. It literally takes me 2 to 4 hours to memorize a paragraph. Yeah, it's, and you're in medicine as well, right? Like, it can be quite hard, but there are things that you can do to overcome some perceived shortfalls in cognition. All right, so what's next on the tier list is something called metacognition. So let's get off this layer and add the next picture, metacognition. So I am wondering how many of you in chat have heard of this concept called metacognition. Gosh, I cannot get the... Whoa, wide. Meta wide. There we go. This concept of metacognition. So how many of you have heard of metacognition before? Metacognition is very vague to me. Yeah, it's not very commonly discussed, I should say. Self-cognition, thinking about your own cognition. I've heard it a bunch. Yeah. Metacognition is that one word that's used extremely frequently to mean nothing much, and people keep reiterating the definition every time it is used. Thinking about thinking. Yes. I've heard it being called thinking about thinking. Exactly. So metacognition is thinking about one's thinking. I'm going to try to do a good job of trying to describe it in a way that actually has meaning to address Catboy's concern. So there's cognition. This is, you know, the nuts and bolts of just how your brain chugs along. But metacognition is your working awareness of how your brain is doing that. So from a very young age, not from a very young age, actually, I think I had this realization when I was like 19 or something, that I just realized that, I'm actually not good at memorizing things. That I had scrimped by high school, not because my memory was good, but because I had just beaten things into my head in an inefficient way that took a lot more work than some of my peers who have better ability for memorization. And so metacognition in that story would be the acknowledgement that I cannot just show up to lecture and do well. I must do something else. And actually teaching this past week, I've had a student or students in my class have a moment of metacognitive realization that they were struggling a bit with the physicality of the lab that they were working with, and they had mentioned that next time we should read the protocol from start to finish before we attempt to start doing work. So that's an acknowledgement that something wasn't working for them in their ability to translate reading the protocol to actually doing the protocol. So they had a metacognitive moment there where they're aware of how they are receiving the information. So before I looked up the literature on metacognition, I would have put metacognition very high up. So I put it in B just kind of temporarily just to have it on the tier list. But before I actually sat down to read, I would have put metacognition in triple S tier, because I've previously read a bunch of research that had shown that students that are more metacognitive, students that have a higher awareness of their own study habits, their own shortcomings, their own strengths, as well as their own ability to recognize that something isn't working for them, those students that have higher metacognitive abilities in those papers that I've read do better. And the question is why? Is it correlation or is it causation? We love correlation versus causation here. And what I've come to realize while perusing the literature is that the literature is inconsistent with describing whether or not that's causative or correlative, right? There is a study out there that showed that metacognition is not associated with better grade performance, I think, when you train students to be metacognitive. So this is sort of a weird case where metacognition likely does help, but is it because better students are metacognitive, or is it because learning to be metacognitive actually does help? So metacognition is teachable. We do know that. And we know that students that are later in their educational careers are more metacognitive than students that are not as far along. So freshmen, not as metacognitive as seniors, but that's correlated with time and experience. Might not be correlated with achievement or absolute grade, right? And so that confused me because I was so sold that this triple S tier concept would definitely be a way for any student to reliably increase their grade. But there's this one paper that describes this sort of stark contradiction as being something to do with awareness not being equivalent to control. And I think that's interesting, right? Just because you're aware of how your brain works doesn't necessarily equate to you being able to do something about it, which I think is interesting. So that is going to take on a different spin as we head further into the tier list, because I want to get into how we sort of attempt to master that control over our metacognition and actually having that mean something to somebody, right? Because there was a paper that showed that just because some students reported better metacognition, that didn't necessarily equate to better grades, and that could be due to not being able to implement those changes that they want to implement. Interestingly enough, students are actually quite capable of identifying good study habits. So there's a study that showed, oh yeah, I'm being quite loose. Usually I would cite things, but this is just like my casual reading. So I'm trying not to propagate misinformation, but this is more of a casual like sharing space. So, you know, if I'm wrong, please correct me in the comments, but there is a paper on metacognition that shows that students, when you survey them and you give them a quiz, they can actually identify in the quiz. So the quiz has like different metacognitive strategies, different study strategies, like should you stay up all night to study? Most students will say no. Should you cram before a test? Most students say no. So students are very capable of understanding what good study habits look like, but that doesn't actually, it doesn't really have that strong of an effect on what their grade actually ends up being. So I love this new realization that I've had from reading the literature, that just because you're aware of the problem doesn't necessarily mean that you're capable in the moment, at the period of time, capable of doing something about it. So I put metacognition in B. And then I'll go back to reading some chat. All right, let's see. Is spaced repetition in that category? So we'll get into study skills later. So the first segment of this tier list is actually more meta kind of abstract concepts, and then spaced repetition is something that we'll get into in study specifics. So I've organized these by category. One metacognition I've experienced is how lousy my auditory memory is. I have to geek out and read over and over and over about something to learn it. Welcome, Pamela, to the stream. That's very interesting that you bring it up, because that's actually in the literature, this idea of learning styles is actually hotly contested, but we'll get to that when we get to that, and we'll see what my thoughts are on this idea of learning styles, what the literature says, as well as what my own opinion is. It seems like a good idea to be able to self-assess. Exactly, like metacognition, I don't think it's useless. I just don't think it's sufficient to improve student performance. It highly depends on if they just give up or work on their strengths and weaknesses. Yes, we're coalescing around this idea that it's not enough to be aware, but you actually have to do something about it. Yes, yes, yes. One gift of age is metacognition. Yeah, definitely. You do get more metacognitive as you get older, yes. How are they measuring metacognitive abilities? That's a great question. So some of those research papers, they're like survey based. So like being able to accurately report, or, you know, in a survey, self-report survey, aspects of their own cognition. Although I don't have a great answer for that, because I had to skim a lot for this stream. I didn't really get to read too in depth on a lot of these papers. Learning styles are about as scientific as love languages. I'm actually going to push back on that a little bit, Catboy. What I I'll push back on it by saying I don't think that learning styles are completely useless or completely incorrect, but there is a growing feeling amongst education researchers that learning styles are not supported by evidence. But we'll get into why my opinion differs slightly. All right. I crammed the entire morning of my bio exam. I knew I should have started revising earlier, but didn't. Exactly. Like, just because you're aware doesn't mean that you necessarily do anything about it. Welcome, Ashton. Welcome to the stream. And welcome the country of the USA. All right. So this is a really good transition point to start talking about non-cognitive skills, because as we're getting, in the chat, this idea that just because you're aware of something doesn't mean anything unless you do something about it. And a lot of that doing has to do with non-cognitive ability. So the first of the non-cognitive skills, or non-cognitive factors, I should say, is this idea of self-efficacy. So what is self-efficacy? Let's see if I can get this in one go without having this be like super wide. There we go. Okay, self-efficacy. So self-efficacy is an individual's belief in their capability to execute on the behaviors needed to achieve certain goals. So this is the complement to metacognition, where metacognition is just kind of your awareness on how you think. Self-efficacy is your belief that you can execute on a plan to do those things. So this is a pretty significant non-cognitive predictor of success, right? If a student and to simplify it a little bit, if a student believes in themselves and believes that they can do it, that will actually take them a pretty good % of the way. If they have a self-sabotaging attitude of helplessness, that is immediately going to sabotage them out of the gate. And of course, a student that doesn't believe that they can do it, well, why bother even trying, right? So research has shown that self-efficacy is a decent predictor of academic success. But again, with a lot of psychology research, it's kind of hard to determine if this is causative, because you cannot experimentally assign some students to be confident and then experimentally assign some other students to not be confident. And this construct is actually built on a feedback loop, right? If you have early success, then that reinforces the idea that you can be successful. And if you don't have that early success, maybe you never learn that, right? I personally felt unburdened when I acknowledged my own faults and my own strengths. I feel like while I was doing pre-med for, 2 decades of my life, that incongruency of what I was aiming towards and how I felt about myself as a potential physician, I was never that confident that I would have made for a good doctor. And I felt like that lack of confidence prevented me from studying as hard as I could have, right? I did not get an A in physio in undergraduate, let's just put it that way. Physio being one of the most important classes for a future physician. And I think there was a bit of me self-sabotaging me in that class. Just making excuses for myself, being, physio is all memorization and I'm bad at memorization. And this is not my strength. I won't be a good doctor because of it. And because of that self-sabotaging behavior, I think I did not work as hard as I needed to get that A. I definitely think that it was in my ability, but I just didn't let myself succeed in that case. Learned helplessness is imposter syndrome. Yeah, I really want to talk a lot about imposter syndrome from an academic point of view. I'm not quite ready to do that yet. But it's interesting, I think, how, your mindset is so important to the heights that you can achieve. And I don't remember which athlete said this. It might have been Mike Tyson, said something to the effect of before a match, there's no doubt in his mind that he's going to win. And of course, Mike Tyson, being a very prolific and very skilled craftsman of his trade, usually does win. But it's more like if you don't, you can easily sabotage yourself if you think that your efforts are going to waste because you don't believe in yourself. So it's important. Believing you're able to learn. Yeah. So I put self-efficacy And, positive self-concept, this general idea that you're good, right here in A, right? Generally a good thing. Whether or not you can experimentally verify that as being causative, who knows? But I think it is, at least from my personal experience, having struggled with self-efficacy in the past, I think it's pretty important. I had to really unlearn learned helplessness. Yeah, it can really get in your way. And it's not easy to get out of it. And this is why, again, that I find non-cognitive skills to be so interesting, is that you can unlearn bad habits or unhealthy mindsets. You can push yourself. It's not easy. It's not straightforward, but you can do it. Whereas thinking about, oh, am I smart enough? Well, I mean, that's not productive, right? Not productive, but you can change these non-cognitive abilities. Or you can work towards that, I should say. Okay, so self-efficacy, that's one axis of non-cognitive skill. Let's start talking about some other non-cognitive abilities. And we'll go with resilience. So, resilience is the process and outcome of successfully adapting to life's challenges through mental, physical, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. So, life and academic life is difficult, always want to be cognizant of that. And resilience, oh, now we're tall. Tall. Okay, resilience. Academic life and life in general, not easy. Life will throw a whole bunch of stuff your way, and it is very, very important that people overcome those challenges. It's not unique to any individual person. Every individual person has their own challenges they must face. And so resilience is a measure-ish of sort of how capable you are of overcoming those challenges. And this is very predictive of positive academic trajectories. So measuring resilience among students, the more resilient a student is, generally the better their trajectory will be. So I think of like the Japanese fisherman, that viral YouTube video of, never give up, that kind of thing. And it certainly sounds like S tier. I agree with you, Hair Day. But I actually put resilience slightly lower in A tier, right? Certainly resilience is important, but we don't want to rely too much on this idea of resilience, because I think resilience is a reactive concept where life threw something hard at you and you had to adapt. Whereas I would prefer more proactive concepts to be higher up in the tier list, because you don't want to just keep on getting beaten down by life and having to crawl your way through certain things. Better skills will allow you to make life easier proactively. And those I will be more inclined to put higher up. But certainly resilience is incredibly important, because nobody lives life without challenge. I was devastated to learn he wasn't actually a fisherman. That's horrible. I didn't know that. Man. How actionable are these? It seems difficult to change your cognition. Exactly. I wouldn't say that it's worth thinking about changing your cognition. I'm not an expert, so I don't know if that's true or not. But these non-cognitive skills, you can imagine, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, that something like positive self-concept or self-efficacy, you might be able to make some headway in something like therapy, which is very, very nice, right? There are things that you can do to improve those things. And even resilience, right? Like you might think of resilience as something that is very inborn in somebody. Oh, that guy's a fighter, or that girl, she can really like overcome anything, and it feels like these are inherent traits. But actually, if you imagine if someone is in a rut, right, like life has just beaten them down, they might not feel very resilient at that moment. So sometimes improving your life circumstance can help you with some of these non-cognitive skills as well. So in terms of how actionable are some of these things, I think these non-cognitive skills are a lot more actionable than cognitive skills, which is why I will tend to rate these a little higher. Okay, so A related concept to resilience is going to be the next item that I pull on this list, and it is the idea and concept of grit. And I couldn't really find a good stock photo, so you'll have to deal with this man gritting his teeth. Hi, TF2 Gamer. Welcome to the stream. So grit, you might think of as being the same as resilience, but actually the psychology literature treats these as slightly different, but different enough to give them different names. So to remind us, resilience is the process and outcome of successfully adapting to life's challenges. Grit is passion plus perseverance. So passion plus perseverance towards long-term goals and sustained commitment. So this is different than resilience, which is more about tackling adversity. So you don't have to experience, terrible life things to show your grit, right? I mean, you can, but you don't have to. So like, for example, a PhD program, which is the same for everybody. And if you don't experience unexpected challenges along the way, the PhD program itself is just quite challenging on its own. But it is a 6-ish year, depending on what your field is, of intense study. So this is more of like biting down and really locking in, you could say, for an extended period of time to achieve the things that you want to achieve. Why is she shirtless? This is the energy. I think this is the energy that we should be aiming to have when it comes to producing our grit, right? I'm going to rate grit very, very highly. This is actually, I think, for me personally, this is going to be the first S tier teaching and learning concept. So grit all the way up in S. So unlike resilience, which you kind of don't really want to pull on all the time because, you don't want to get good at getting beaten down by life. But grit, passion plus perseverance, that I think is in all cases very effective and worth striving for, right? So resilience is enduring something while grit is pushing ahead. Yeah, that's a great way, I think, to frame it. Pushing ahead, just like not giving up on your goals. Whereas resilience is, I need to make it out alive. It's like a different mentality, I think. Obsession says hyperfocus. Not always true, although hyperfocus does help with the PhD. And obsession also does help. But that might go a little far away from this idea of perseverance through long-term goals, because you can get temporarily obsessed with something, right? So grit is more about that sustained commitment. And this is something that if you can develop this early on in your educational or academic career, or even your working life, that's always going to be good for you. It's never going to be bad for you. It's always going to help to have high grit. Never give up. Exactly. I wouldn't even say never give up, because I myself gave up trying to be a doctor when I realized that's not what I wanted to do, right? So even though being a doctor was my long-term plan, I didn't have, you could say I didn't have the grit to make it as a doctor. I would more say that my long-term goals changed. So it's more like, if you want something and you want it bad enough, then don't give up. I didn't want being a doctor enough. That's all. Okay, so this idea of grit and pushing yourself through hard times, this leads nicely into two separate but related ideas. This idea of intrinsic motivation, because these factors can affect your goals, right? We're talking about goals in motivation. I was not ever really that motivated to be a doctor. So this is helpful in understanding how we can sort of cultivate a sense of grit and really allow ourselves to be who we want to be in our academic world. The PhD is the friends we made along the way. True. Hi, first time properly tuning into a stream. Would you mind telling a bit more about your background leader? I'll do that right now. For those of you who don't know, you've seen my channel. I am a content creator who makes biology content, high-level biology content that I find interesting. But my professional background, I have a graduate degree in molecular and cell biology, and I teach full-time. I teach a biology lab to undergraduates. So I am a professional teacher, but I'm not an education researcher. So that would be my summary of how I would call my background. intrinsic motivation for S tier, extrinsic motivation for D tier. That's, I think, an interesting perception because I'm going to slightly disagree. I'm not going to disagree that much. And I initially, again, before doing my reading, would have agreed with you, Hairday, that extrinsic motivation seems to be quite counterintuitive. So what do I mean by intrinsic versus extrinsic? So intrinsic motivation is doing something for inherent satisfaction, and extrinsic motivation is doing something for a promised reward, right? So I would say that I am intrinsically motivated to make content for YouTube, right? I love doing it. Even though I've made content for like a decade and was never happy with any of it, I never gave up making content because the process of making content and seeing myself improve over the course of a decade of making stuff was very rewarding, right? Like I don't do YouTube for, you know, the AdSense, although the AdSense is nice and it does help. But even if I never made any money, I think I would still be trying to make biology content because it's inherently rewarding. Whereas when I was a pre-med, I was extrinsically motivated to be a doctor. My parents wanted to set me up for a comfortable life. They pushed me to be a doctor. I liked biology, bodies, not as much, but the idea of a comfortable life where you don't have to worry about money, extrinsically motivating. And so what the research has shown is that yes, extrinsic motivation, extremely useful. Students who have high intrinsic motivation, they have positive academic trajectories, right? If you care about doing a good job, then that is, you know, great, right? If the very idea of doing well in school is motivating and you want to do a good job for the sake of doing a good job, I am actually so jealous of those people. I'm so jealous of those people. I think Toxo is someone who is like this, who wants to do a good job just for the sake of doing a good job, whereas I will cut corners for things that I don't care about. That's not to say I don't have any intrinsic motivation. I'm just more selective with what I am intrinsically motivated by. And so extrinsic motivations actually do play a significant role in motivating students throughout their academic career as well, to a much larger extent than I gave it credit for. And it feels kind of wrong, right? Like if you're offered this carrot as a reward, as soon as the carrot isn't there, then, you know, where's that motivation gone? Well, it turns out that as long as those motivations are promised and that those motivations are still there, as long as they are still there, they do offer benefits, right? So some people just want to go and make money, right? I think of finance people a lot when I think of this, and maybe I'm overgeneralizing, but if you like money, don't be a scientist. If you like money, go to Wall Street, right? Study your ass off, learn how to do a lot of good math. And if you just want to make money, go to Wall Street, trade, you know, if you are rewarded by the idea of making a ton of money. I can't say that that's worse than an intrinsic motivation to make content for YouTube, right? They're still allowing you to persevere through to a long-term goal. It's just my goal is to make dumb cartoons online, and their goal is to retire at 40. And who's to say which is better, right? But in terms of like what is more sustainable, if it doesn't require an outside influence, intrinsic is going to be better because you don't need that carrot in front of you at all times. All right. Has there been any research into how effective different types of motivation are? Maybe there are ways to combine them as well. Yeah, I don't really know, again, reading for breadth and not for depth, how deeply they have studied how these affect GPA. This is more from just like personal teaching philosophy, honestly. I'm glad you didn't give up, just found your channel recently, and it's great. Thank you so much. I feel like a major bio content like Kierkegaard is lacking sometimes. Kierkegaard is made for everybody, whereas mine is made for after you watch Kierkegaard video and you want more. Yeah, I aim to make content that I would enjoy if I weren't studying biology, right? So I think like Niall Red, fascinating chemistry channel, but I'm not a chemist, and so him going a little more deep into that kind of stuff is endlessly fascinating. It hits as hard as I want it to hit. by Kierkegaard, again, really great content, amazing content, is made for everybody, whereas mine really isn't. I first wanted to do architecture, but it didn't look viable for me, and so I got more into biology. Yeah, like, there's no shame in changing your long-term goals based on external motivation, just because we all need to eat. You know, we all need to live, and job markets can be volatile. And as much of a romantic I am for like academia and the pursuit of what you actually want to do, life doesn't really always shake out that way. Of course, it's my job to try to push you in a direction where you're doing something that you want to do that can make you money. It doesn't always happen, and there's nothing wrong with that. Yep, the carrot being taken away is a thing that can just happen. Exactly. It's not as reliable. Yeah. The education system has killed most of my intrinsic motivation that I had for learning the topics we need to learn. It can be quite tricky, which is why maintaining that motivation, you know, for students, if you can, sometimes there are things outside of your control as an educator. It's important. And again, learning doesn't just happen in the classroom. It's your entire life, right? Your environment and the people you are surrounded by. Yeah, so motivation, it's important. Some motivation is more sustainable than others. So the idea of support actually brings me to the next topic, which is, support. So this is pretty short. If you have a support network, the better your support network. You know, this isn't just an academics thing, but the more people that you like in your life that like you, and you get along together, and you have a shoulder to cry on, and you don't feel so alone. A lot of these mental health impediments to your academic success can be alleviated by forming strong connections with other people. So pretty simply, support is S tier. If you're just starting college and you've moved away from home and you don't know anybody, it can be very difficult to find friends. I know, as a introverted VTuber, asocial, every stereotype about VTubers out there, I found it very hard to make friends. In fact, I would say in my first year, I think I went the entire year without making any what I would consider true friends. And that's not for a lack of trying. I went to dorm events and stuff, and I chatted with people, but I'm very particular when it comes to hanging out with people I like. And that can be quite tough. But again, perseverance and grit. If it's important to you to find friends, just keep on rolling that dice, and eventually you'll find a group of people that you like. Oh, something is happening. Let's go ahead and do that. Okay. So so support is really, really important. I'd love to make friends, but I'm autistic. There are other autistic people out there. Support is super S tier. Okay. I definitely could have used more of that. Yeah, we all can. And that's something, again, this is why I hope you're starting to see that like smartness is so not like the whole picture when it comes to finding success. It's certainly a part of success, but there are so many other things that you can do that are not locked up in this notion of unchanging IQ that can really help with achieving your goals. I don't mean to be like a spiritual or self-help guru or anything. This is just like from an academic in-classroom kind of perspective. So along the same lines of support is therapy/medication. So I have advocated for therapy for a very long time. I myself did not use therapy when I was an undergraduate. Big mistake. I did in graduate school, but by then I think I had many wasted years of not feeling comfortable in my own intellectual skin. So if you have a situation where you are offered therapy and it's compensated, please, if you're an undergraduate and you find yourself struggling, take it. If you have something that you would like to work on, speak to a counselor, right? That's just good advice. I think what tends to be thrown around these days in terms of advice regarding therapy is, oh, everybody should get therapy. I think that is true, but when you walk into a therapist's office, you should have some kind of idea of what you want to talk about. you should have some sort of idea of something that you want to talk about. So for me, I had always mulled the idea of getting therapy as an undergraduate, but I didn't really have a solid idea of what I would talk about. I just felt like I was uncomfortable and insecure. In graduate school, it really coalesced that what I was feeling was sensitive about my perceived intelligence, that I felt that because my memory was so bad and I'm surrounded by these brilliant biologists who have great memories, who appear like I remember early in graduate school chatting with some of my graduate student peers, and I was just like, man, like the papers that we have to read, they're so hard and I can't, like I spent so long on them. And then I heard them reply like, yeah, man, I spent 3 hours on that paper we had to read for class today. And inside I felt 3 hours? I spent like 8 on the same paper. And I didn't have as strong of an understanding as they did after 3. And those moments where you are struck with your limitation, they were quite devastating for me, because I knew in my heart that I wanted to do biology, but I was running away from this feeling that I didn't deserve to, or that I wasn't built for it because of my memory issues, which I'm quite open about now. And going to therapy and speaking with my therapist about understanding who I am as a student was very, very helpful. My therapist actually made me say something that I liked about my own brain. And that simple act of acknowledging that, oh, I'm not just like Garbo, that like really, I had like a breakdown in the moment. I cried, like verbalizing something that I like about myself was really important. And, you know, a therapist can help you, like, you know, maybe that's not the approach for you, but what I'm saying is that, like, if you have something that you want to talk about, I would not hesitate to reach out, especially if it's paid for already. There's no excuse if it's already paid for. All right. So, therapy is S tier. Please, if you have something you want to chat about, especially if it's free, go ahead and do it. Sensitive boys are the most oppressed groups. That's why therapy is goated. Yeah. That's only if you have access to a good enough therapist. Yes, but, you know, it takes a while to find a good match. You shouldn't expect to find an amazing therapist right off the bat. But I did in graduate school. My first shot was immediately really good. And when I went back for therapy with a different therapist, it didn't really end up as well. And I did not continue that relationship with that therapist. So just know that it's normal to not find a therapist that is suited for your needs. Yes, the drugs part. So if you find yourself struggling in academia and you have made good attempts at improving some of these non-cognitive skills, but you just feel like you can't, or something is preventing you, there's like a non-zero chance you might qualify for some kind of accommodation or some kind of supplementation, we'll say. So if you find that you might, just looking around, if you think you might qualify for something that would require medication to help you focus, it can be quite life-changing. So that's also something to think about. Of course, it's not necessarily the case for every student, but if you find yourself just completely unable to do certain things, despite a honest, good effort attempt, you might find yourself benefiting from something like medication. So that's something to be aware of. I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't really speak too much more about that. I just know from reading people's stories that once they got on the medication that they needed to be on, their like whole life like really, really changed. And that's, worth considering. I've heard there's epidemics of people using Adderall when not prescribed. Yeah, that's kind of what I'm like dancing around. Don't obviously abuse the system, but if you find yourself needing it, then there's no shame in getting the help that you need. But then you realize you're in Asia and no one does therapy ever. Sad, but no quick way out of this situation. You might be able to find remote people. I don't really know how international therapy works. It's kind of interesting. I never bothered to think about how, if you could get therapy from somebody in a different country, that would be interesting to look into. Yeah, I am quite sorry. Like therapy, it can be quite hard to talk about in Asian at least in East Asian contexts, but I think America has done a decent job at destigmatizing that idea, and for that I am grateful. Okay. Now we get into something that is a little controversial, talking about more meta things, like from a wide scope. And that is going to be this idea of learning styles. So when I was growing up, when I was in class, we were taught that some, different people had different affinities for learning styles. So some people were more auditory learners, some people were more visual learners, some people were more somatosensory learners, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, when I was training for teaching as as an undergraduate student, I was taking a course on the theoretical background on pedagogy, right? And so we were taught canonically that learning styles exist and that we should be aware that people learn in different modalities. I think what is becoming more clear in terms of the academic research is that this is not the whole picture. I'll say that the adaptation of learning styles and the awareness, the metacognitive awareness of learning styles doesn't appear to make a difference in absolute performance in the classroom. So that's not to discredit any individual person's experience with learning styles. Certainly, I believe that I do better when I am reading as opposed to listening. Again, the working memory thing, auditory signals are temporary, right? Once someone says a sentence, it's over. Whereas reading, I can always reread a sentence. It's not as devastating to reread a sentence than it is to not remember the first half of a sentence. Again, my memory, very, very bad. But what I'll say is this, is that the research does show that people have real preferences for their learning style. That is 100%, I believe, 100% real, that when you poll people, they will be drawn towards one learning style over another. So the reason why I don't put learning style as low as some people might want me to put low is because learning styles and contemplating learning styles is still a somewhat metacognitive activity, that you can still have some sort of honest reflection about how you're learning. And for me, it was that, the reason why lecture is not so great for me personally is because by the time a professor finishes a sentence, the beginning of the sentence will be very hazy to me. And so is it because I'm a bad auditory learner? Not necessarily. It's just that I find that it doesn't really quite work doesn't really quite work the same as reading a paper. But what does help is exposure to different modalities of learning. So to not only have auditory material, but to have written material, to have a good mix of different approaches, that does, I believe, at least the personal experience, benefit students, so that you can have different avenues of reinforcement, engage more of your brain instead of pigeonholing in one particular modality. So the rigid implementation of learning styles can also be quite problematic if we're too dogmatic about believing in learning styles. That can really constrain the design of the classroom. So for those reasons, I'm not going to put learning styles in F, although I kind of removed the F tier. So I'll put it in D. There's no true F tier learning and pedagogy thing, but it is in D, I think. Okay. Veritasium did a breakdown video showing that people learn better with multiple different methods of input. Exactly. Like having different modalities and options and simultaneous options, that is good. Better than one style alone. I feel like learning stuff is more linked to how much attention, mental resources you dedicate to understanding something than a particular learning method, but my style was Anki flashcards. Yeah, attention/mental resources to dedicate and understand something, that's a bit simplified because people can go about learning in a very inefficient way. And I'm going to get into inefficient methods of studying later on in the tier list. So it's not really about the effort, it's about the smart use of effort or useful use of effort. I can't do most learning styles because I just don't have a preferred method of learning, or all the methods of learning that are options don't work for me. I wonder if that is true. And you might change your opinion after hearing about the theoretical basis behind pedagogy throughout the tier list. Personally, when I'm the one who figures something out for some specific purposes, it really sticks in my mind. So re-deriving something, re-deriving something from scratch. Does that lead into the next thing? Almost. So that's something that I call actively learning. Re-derivation is definitely active, and active learning is shown to be a more effective method of teaching and learning than more passive methods. But we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. Okay, we are now going to get into teaching meta. So this section is teaching meta. The next section will be learning meta or study meta. So teaching meta. And this is something that I have talked about on stream before, but now I get to do a little bit more with it. Bloom's taxonomy. So I learned about this when I was an undergraduate. This is a theoretical framework for structuring educational goals. So this is a tool. At first, I was very reluctant to adopt this tool because it seemed like very soft psychology. Like, how do we know that knowledge precedes comprehension, precedes application and analysis, synthesis, and evaluation? Like, does that neurologically make sense? Like, do we have studies that can confirm that? I was a very skeptical, little arrogant teacher. But over time, I've come to realize that Bloom's taxonomy is actually very, very, very useful. What is Bloom's taxonomy? So it's a way to organize educational goals. So it's been revised a couple times. This is the version of Bloom's taxonomy that I myself am more familiar with, and that is at the bottom of the pyramid, the most base educational goal is knowledge. So if I were to ask you right now what the mitochondria is, if you've ever taken a biology class, you should have a working knowledge of what the mitochondria is, right? Comprehension is a little more complex than knowledge. So this is, do you really understand what the mitochondria does? Like, are you able to make basic if-then statements about the mitochondria? Application is, are you able to use that knowledge in constructive ways? So And these applications can vary between field to field, but the idea is that you get more complex all the way up until you get to synthesis and evaluation. Or in the case of science, you get something more like creation of novel research projects, right? So again, I wouldn't take this for a psychology construct, more like a teaching tool. And why this is important is this structure is something that I pull out when I try to troubleshoot a student's understanding or misunderstanding of a certain topic, right? So say a student has some misunderstanding, or they're just getting something wrong and they don't quite understand what's going on. By thinking about Bloom's taxonomy, I can interrogate that student, and I use the word interrogate very lightly, right? Politely interrogate the student and figure out where in the pyramid does their understanding fail? Like, do they not know what a cell is? Like, how far back do I have to go in the pyramid to pinpoint exactly where the issue is? So in that sense, this is a very good troubleshooting tool. It's a very good lesson planning tool because you generally want to try to go in this order, right? You obviously don't start off with design an experiment without students knowing the basic biology behind what that experiment would be, right? So as a teaching tool, I put Bloom's taxonomy in A tier. This goes in A tier for me. Okay, again in the teaching meta, so choices in the classroom and choices in course design, we have homework. So this one is controversial, right? Homework. So I'm pretty caught, pretty conflicted about how I think about homework. Generally, assigning homework and doing homework is associated with improved performance. It's hard to design homework that feels meaningful or fun. It is maybe not that controversial to believe that the more work you do, generally, the better understanding you get just because you put more effort into it. But homework can be done in very, busybody, not exciting kinds of ways. But for the sake of enforcing mastery of a certain set of concepts, you can't get rid of homework. I think that I think there was a paper that tried, and what they found is that you still have to, so the theoretical basis for homework is that you don't do all of your learning in class, that you space out the learning process, and that improves retention. So even though I don't love homework, you have to do it to get good, because that's just how learning works. So I begrudgingly put it in B. It's useful. It's difficult to make useful sometimes. It can be quite demotivating. Like, there are downsides to this. And this also hits, people of different backgrounds differently, right? With people who have inequitable backgrounds, right? People who have home lives that are not constructive or safe or peaceful enough to do homework. Assigning homework can actually punish them, because if they don't manage to do it, then you have to give them a lower number, right? So in an ideal world, I would put this higher, but practically, it's like, yeah, you have to do it. We have to give it. It's not perfect, though. Yeah. Homework was originally invented as a punishment. It makes sense for some classes like language classes, but otherwise it should all be done in class. Optional, sure, but it shouldn't be like that now. Again, I think the literature might suggest that homework is still useful. I think we just have to be smarter about how we design it. Interleaving studying has been shown to be consistently better than cramming. And if you do all of your learning in the classroom, that's essentially cramming, but during the daytime. In the library world, we have the information hierarchy: lowest to highest, data, information, knowledge, and wisdom. Yeah, I like that. I like that hierarchy. I don't like homework because it feels almost entirely like work that's being assigned to make me busy. Yes, and that is why I don't put homework higher than B tier. It's still useful, it's just you have to design it very carefully for it to be useful. It also has a bit of an active learning component to it. Exactly, active learning, much more preferable to passive learning. I never did my homework and it screwed me in uni. Exactly, like, I think that it's a very popular idea to want to get rid of homework as a construct, but I just don't think it's a good idea. And believe me, I want to, because I don't like homework. I didn't like homework. I wanted to like have fun. But okay, what else we got? I think there shouldn't be hours of homework each night, but homework itself can be useful. Yeah, exactly. The implementation of homework can be quite tricky. My math classes had me spent days on formal proofs. Yeah. I don't know, because I don't teach math, but I can see the logic behind requiring a formal proof for homework if you are studying math. You probably need to dedicate time about what you learned in class outside of class, though. Exactly. And, in university, we treat students like adults, but to master the discipline to go over the stuff outside of class, it's like you can never make everybody happy, right? Like, students will complain about getting homework, and then when you don't give them homework and they don't know the material, then they complain. Like, academics, the academy is structured, right? Learning in a classroom is structured. And I know that not everybody likes the structure, but I believe the data shows that structure and good implementation of homework is very useful. Your VTuber is snapping back and forth. Oh, it might be because my microphone is blocking my face. Hopefully that's a little better. The solution would be optional homework. I don't agree with that personally, in my personal experience. I don't know anything about studies that show whether or not optional assignment of homework helps. In terms of my personal experience, when you make assignments optional, students don't do it, and then they don't learn. They just don't. You may believe, and you may be right, that you are capable of learning without doing the homework. Certainly a thing that can happen. What is true on a mass scale is that for many people, they need that additional structure to enforce those learning habits. Now, what is something that I think is worth discussing is leeway and forgiveness. So say, for example, there are classes that I've been a part of that have had free homework. And what that would basically mean is that you got to miss 2 homeworks without penalty. So you got to choose which homeworks you did not do. And that breadth was useful because you got to sort of game around your busy lifestyle. I think that idea has merit, although it doesn't really work for every single class, right? Not every discipline, not every class type will have that be a viable alternative to just having normal homework. Yeah, I told you homework is homework is a controversial topic, but I am bullish on reinforcing learning outside of the classroom because, in my experience, if you make it optional, students just won't do it. That's all. And even like students at a very high level, right? Like if you don't put in that external motivation to get the high grade, I think people's intrinsic motivation to do well is overestimated in those particular cases, because even the best intrinsically motivated people without the guardrails of a syllabus can veer off into academic oblivion. Okay. All right, next topic. Lecture. So, lecture can be another, again, like homework, your mileage may vary. Different professors are differently astute in their pursuit of pedagogical improvement. And so you can get all sorts of different lecture qualities as well as different lecture goals. Like that lecture can mean different things for different professors in different fields and different classes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, how I think of lecture is an introduction to the concepts that you will need to then master. So on Bloom's taxonomy, if I'm thinking about educational goals, lecture, in my experience, generally deals with the more bottom stuff. So knowledge, comprehension, application, maybe. But the higher level stuff, I think, is gated behind other educational formats. In my experience, this format has one very, very important function outside of just conveying the skills that you need to succeed in this particular class, and that is to maintain motivation. So a talented professor who cares about lecture can have lecture be a space for cultivating passion. So if you have a professor who likes teaching and is good at it, and makes the field interesting, it can contribute to your sense of motivation, your intrinsic motivation, right? And that's something that I try to do myself when I teach, try to make the material interesting, engaging, and relevant for the students so they stay motivated to continue to take the course. And like in my particular role, there is less of an opportunity to do that than some of the professors, because the professors are the ones that you look up to for the peak of scientific success. And they can give you insight that I cannot in my position. They can give you interesting stories that I cannot give in my position. I was never past graduate school a professional scientist, so I can't give that insight. So lecture, I think, is undervalued in the motivational aspect of the teaching environment. And for that, and people may disagree, but I give lecture, I will put lecture in A tier. Even though I, like many students, I skipped lectures as well. But still, in terms of its use in the realm of education, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. You should go to lecture. Yeah. Lecture is good, but it's not like easy to seek for a specific detail within one. Yeah, it's not the perfect learning format. No format is perfect. Otherwise, we would just have one learning format, right? We have different structures for different educational goals. Yeah. Lecture has a high skill floor, but also a high skill ceiling. Yeah, I know. I've had wonderful professors whose lectures I would drag myself out of bed to attend because I genuinely wanted to get better at whatever it is that they were teaching. It's really difficult to stay focused. Yeah, I agree. That's why, like, that's another downside. This particular format is very passive, right? Students are hearing the information. A lot of lecture is the professor talking to students, not the students talking amongst each other, which we'll get into in a little bit. Because the next format outside of lecture, and I'm wondering how common the terminology is here. not only do we have lecture, we also have something called recitation slash precept. And I'm wondering, different universities call these things different names. So I'm kind of curious as to what you call these. So in my universities, I've heard it recitation, I've heard it as precept. These are additional class sessions that are not led by the professor, but by typically one of the TAs, teaching assistants. And in these sessions, these are usually in smaller groups, so not the whole 300 student lecture hall, but like groups of 10, where 10 students will work with the TA and work on a problem set or work in a discussion group or something. And for me, this hits upon some really solid concepts, because not only do you get to actually do learning, like you get to work with your own hands, write down your own derivations or work out your own math problems or do your own logical thinking and contribute in one of these smaller sessions, or see how things are done step by step depending on the class. This is a lot more active than lecture. It doesn't work without lecture. You still need, and this is why Bloom's taxonomy is important, you still need that base knowledge to be able to appreciate recitations as precept. Because if you just walk in and expect to be like, oh, the TA will just teach me how to do everything, if you don't get that background knowledge from lecture, you might not be able to efficiently make use of your TA as a resource. So I think recitation slash precept plays a very, very important role in the academy. Or in your in the educational system, right? It's the place where you get to test your mettle. You get to test your actual understanding of the material, because the thing with a great professor, one that can yap on and you cling to every word, is that they're really good at communication and you never feel confused. You never know if you've actually learned something. You can have the best professor speak in the most clear terms possible, but until you evaluate your self-understanding, you have no idea if you've actually learned. In fact, lecturers who are really good at that kind of thing can often lull you into a false sense of security where you think you've learned something, but then when you try to replicate and problem solve on your own, you've actually found that you've not actually learned anything. So I put precept slash recitation similarly as a complement to lecture in A tier. So go to those precept sessions, please. Ooh, office hours. I should have put office hours in this tier list. Dang. I've never had anything like this. Interesting. Not even for your math classes. Math classes, I think, have this all the time, where it was like the TA, and you had a problem set and you would just work on the problem set and the TA would help you. That's really interesting. My university courses are so busy that additional learning is barely workable. Is this really maybe a rare structure to have? I kind of assumed this was quite common. Interesting. That fake learning was actually my econ teacher last year. Yeah, it happens a lot. You be able, a good eloquent person can make you feel like you've learned when you've not at all. S tier, office hours. Yeah, I would put office hours in S tier. Oftentimes, professors will just tell you what you need to know directly. There's no mystery behind it. They want you to come. It's boring. I have office hours, and my students don't really utilize it all that often. And if you come with good pointed questions, like don't just go in and be like, teach me how to get an A. But if you go in and you go, I don't understand how to do this problem, you get directly from the source how to do it, right? Office hours, triple S tier. If I didn't go to office hours for my biophysics class in undergraduate, I would have completely failed. I was so desperate to not fail that the only thing saving me was repeated trips to my professor's office. Given the biophysics professor I had, not good. But if you are there, you can kind of strong arm them into helping you in a way that actually works, instead of just watching someone derive formulas for an hour. Oh my gosh. So what I'm hearing is the recitation stuff is actually quite rare. That's really wild. That's crazy. What are office hours? Office hours are times that your professors will set aside for students to come and talk about, whatever, pretty much. Like, you can talk about whatever, but most students use it for increasing their performance in certain classes. I'm not going to read that comment he is on, but my university was similar as well, honestly. Yeah. Okay. So, let's see. What is next on the list here? All right. So I have a particular bias for this next item, and that would be lab. So, as you may know at this point, I am an instructor for a lab class. And I'm not going to sugarcoat it. Lab is S tier. Why is lab S tier? Lab, I think, unlike lecture/precept recitation, is self-sufficient. Like, lecture and precept work together to form a complete level of learning, but lab will take you from the bottom to the top. And why is that? Because in a science context, you are doing the actual science. It is very active. You are there, you are doing it. And for students who want to go into biology or in science, you get to try it out. Isn't that incredible? You get to actually try what it's like to be an actual professional. And you can inform yourself as to whether or not you want to have science as a long-term goal. Like, that is invaluable to a student. Obviously, I want people to enjoy biology, but if you don't, if you do the lab and you find this kind of sucks, find something that you want to do and be happy, right? Very, very active form of learning. You are actually working with your hands and interpreting data and doing all the things that a real scientist does so that you can try it out. The thing about medicine that infuriated me is that I had no idea what it was going to be like and never got to try it. I applied for so many different internships at hospitals. I got rejected from all of them. There's no like medical lab. There's no like be a doctor lab in university, right? You can't do that. The opportunity to actually put on the gloves and the coat and the pipette, that is important for so many different things. And you learn, again, the basics of how to do something in a lab, and you get all the way to interpreting and making your own experiments, right? Thinking critically like a scientist. Lab, I think, is a all-in-one, amazing, amazing, amazing teaching tool. So it's unproblematically an S tier. You feel very smart doing lab stuff. Exactly, exactly. What labs did for me, they create intrinsic motivation. They make me love the subject. Yeah. Lab is annoying because 90% of it is waiting around for that other group member to do a thing. I mean, you have to be patient with group members. I just watched some students pipette for maybe one of the first times in their lives. And of course, they're going to start slow, but they're going to be masters by the end of the class, and it's going to be great. But in lab, I created mass from nothing multiple times. Ooh, I love chemistry lab. I love getting 400% yields on my crappy purifications. That's how I knew I was not fit to be a chemist. Ooh, all the like very dangerous setups that you have to do, and all the TAs being like, if you set up this distillation rod, it could explode. I was like, I don't think I'm cut out to be a chemist. My internship next semester is in a biological lab. That's amazing. I hope you have a lot of fun. You know, biolabs can be quite boring in the sense that there's a lot of downtime. But, you know, life happens at a slower rate than chemical reactions sometimes. One of my classmates boiled HCl once. Yeah. Labs are great. I wish there was something similar for non-STEM disciplines. There is, and it is the next thing on the list. Thank you for teasing that, Thomas. And that is discussion. Discussion. So, I minored in English. Oh, sorry, there's some good questions back in chat. How does lab work? Can you go into it with when you want? Is it classes in a lab? Is there any way to practice go out of hours? So some universities will have like a maker space where it is like a free space where you can do stuff. But for most universities, you take a class. So you will attend a class maybe 2 or 3 times a week, and you will do experiments that are structured for you by the instructors. So you will do a science project with the guardrails on. All right. So what I consider to be lab, but for non-STEM majors, are discussion-based classes, right? And I minored in English, so I took quite a few of these classes, and I loved them. I loved discussion classes because in discussion-based classes, not only do you practice the critical skills of communication, right? Like you practice forming intelligent thoughts, forming and sharing intelligent thoughts, and you practice listening to your peers and picking up on what they're saying, and it's a back and forth. And of course, something that is widely applicable to getting a job is the ability to communicate. Never, 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 never underestimate the value of coming across like you know what you're talking about. That can often be the difference between getting hired and not. If you practice making sense and practice actively listening to people and responding to them, not only do you make them feel listened to and valued and intelligent, but they view you in a similar way. And those muscles that you need to have like an academic conversation can be quite useful when it comes to interviewing. But not only that, for all the like snobby STEM majors out there back in my undergrad who would constantly just, you know, crap on all the humanities majors saying how they'll never make any money and their major is so much easier. Discussion actually in humanities classes can be more critically demanding than a lot of STEM classes, and that might shock some STEM majors. Now, what is undeniable is that it is easier to get a higher number in a humanities course generally. I'm not arguing that, but I'm talking about Bloom's taxonomy. I feel like in my undergraduate as a biology major, I was never critically thinking. I was just bashing information into my head, except for lab classes where I was able to play with critical thinking for a little bit. But in English classes, in philosophy classes, in history classes, as long as it's led by somebody competent, you get critical thinking from when you are essentially the age of 18. Right? Whereas I had to wait until graduate school to do the same, because in STEM, you just have to learn a lot more facts. Like the density of information that you need to learn, I think, for STEM classes is just more. So before you get to do the actual interesting hard stuff with your brain, you have to learn how to do a lot of math. You have to do a lot of memorization for biology, et cetera, et cetera. But for English class, you can be challenged. Your ideas, your background, your assumptions, they're challenged from day one, assuming the class is good, right? And I think that similar level of engagement, that active learning, that development of communication ability, to me, discussion-based classes, you can easily get an A in a lot of them if you just like, you know, half it, you know. But I recommend, if you are in a discussion class, to treat it with respect. Like, respect the fact that you are offered the opportunity to practice forming and communicating intelligent thought. So I put discussion in S tier. Yeah, discussion is really good. Yeah. So I'm catching up on chat just a little bit. All right. Humanities classes often felt like, how much did the teacher like you? Again, mileage may vary a lot, and I did feel like I did feel like my STEM professors that were bad at teaching were consistently bad at teaching, meaning that it was predictable about why they were bad at teaching. I feel like humanities professors, in my personal experience, I've had some fantastic ones, and I've had some that were uniquely interesting, we'll say. Math has a lot of reasoning, and physics is like 1 to 3 retention and 2/3 reasoning, I'd say. But yeah. I like, math is a lot of reasoning, but if you are learning math in order to do biology, for example, you can just kind of brute force it and not engage critically. You can. It's not very good, but you can. The humanities are for learning how to communicate and for social/emotional learning. Yeah, and having, again, your ideas critically challenged, because in STEM, you're not, in an undergraduate 4-year degree, in my experience, nothing really challenged my understanding of the world, right? I wasn't really forced to reevaluate my understanding of things, except chemistry, right? Oh, what do you mean the Bohr model of the atom was like wrong? But like, even that I don't think is, you know, instead of critically challenging the Bohr model and then having you come up with something better, they just give you what the quote unquote more right answer is, which isn't really critical. It's just kind of hard to reason through. All right. Okay, so discussion, love discussion classes. Take your humanities classes seriously. They're really great, I think, for personal development. All right. More aspects of the classroom. Quizzes. Okay, quizzes. Another potentially controversial thing. I think it's less controversial than it has to be. So quizzes can be stressful, but telegraphed quizzes, in my opinion, are not bad. So quizzes can result, at least in personal experience, heightened student anxiety, unhappiness, etc., etc. But if you just make these like a low percent of the overall grade, and maybe even lump it in with the participation part of the rubric, I think quizzes can enforce the expectation that students stay on top of their learning. So it's more, unlike homework where it's very rote, just do it and you'll get the number. Quizzes are like, do it and like actually understand it, and then you'll be more prepared for class. So even though I don't love quizzes as a concept for the same reasons that I don't love homework, it feels like there's some pressure and that's not always fun. But if you make it low stakes and you make it clear that you're making it low stakes, I think it's all right. I think quizzes can serve a function. Quizzes are great, but I think that it's annoying when there's a quiz every class and I'm forced to stare at a wall for 15 minutes after I finish every time. Trade-offs in terms of classroom design. What do you think of assigning papers in the field as reading as a teaching method? Depends on where the student is in terms of their reading comprehension. So obviously, to give a freshman a research paper would be inappropriate, but certainly a senior, that's obviously, not obviously, but that, in my opinion, is very appropriate. They should be learning how to read professional literature at that point. So far, this tier list is top heavy. Pedagogy often focuses on things that work instead of things that don't, but there will be stuff that is on the lower end of things. Okay. So the next one, maybe predictably, are exams. Again, like with quizzes, with homework, I don't love them. Creates pressure. Wish we didn't have to do it, but pretty essential. Now, I know people say that they are bad at tests, that some people have an anxiety surrounding exams. I totally get that. I understand. Unfortunately, for evaluation, especially in a STEM context, we don't really have a better way to evaluate if you've understood everything. So it's more of this like necessary evil, but I mean, you kind of have to, otherwise how do we know you actually learned anything for a STEM class, especially? There aren't that many essays that you can write about biology that really allow you to demonstrate a mastery of the subject. What about like research papers that cover the original discovery of the concept? That was more of a graduate school thing. So we read a lot of foundational papers as graduate school students. And they're hard to read, Marlon. I don't know if you've read a classic molecular biology paper, but they are tough. And I took a look at them again, given my years of reading paper experience now, they're still tough. They're not easy to read. A lot of exams don't actually test your knowledge of the subject, just the rubric test-taking strategy. You can improve your grade by implementing test-taking strategy. That is very true, but you can design exams where you are actually testing excellence and mastery of the material. For example, essay questions, long-form essay questions instead of multiple choice, that dives a little deeper into whether or not you've actually understood the prompt, right? So a cell biology class that I TA'd for in graduate school, I loved their design of the class because they had these sections called You Be the Scientist. So you would get a prompt that would show a lab result and what the student had done. And then you would have to reason what happened and how to fix it. Very good thing to know and skill to practice. So that's a skill. So you can test mastery. And of course, biology being the memorization heavy subject that it is, will require a lot of memorization, and so things like multiple choice, we need to at least make sure you recognize the right answer for a lot of things. So again, it's not perfect, but it is not, it doesn't have to be. It's pretty good. Pretty good. Exams seem important as they force you to learn. Exactly, extrinsically motivating you to actually get into shape and read the dang things, or study the dang things, I should say. Exams usually don't give me much stress. I'm good in tests, but bad in critical thinking in labs. We all have different strengths, and it's all about practice. Yeah, your mileage may vary, Thomas. Exactly, I agree. The development of early notation is also fascinating, like seeing people develop the tools for reasoning and modeling novel concepts. You can often have that as aspects of your lecture instead of having people read ancient literature, which again, we had to do in graduate school, and I loved reading it. I loved learning how to read it. Not appropriate for undergraduates in my estimation. All right. In my time, exams cause more intrinsic motivation than extrinsic, mainly because the extreme fear of failure. Yeah, I relate to that. I didn't want to fail, and so it got my butt into gear. Although failure itself as a motivation type is interesting, because are you afraid of failing because you don't want to fail, or is it because you are afraid of people being disappointed in you? It's kind of an interesting line to draw. All right, so this one is kind of vague. This one is in-class activities. So this is kind of a catch-all for when you're in a lecture and then your professor makes you do something. Maybe get up and write on a whiteboard or on a big post-it note. For me, this can be helpful. It can also be hokey and a waste of time. It's it's tough to know exactly how effective these kind of free-form quote unquote creative activities can be. I don't count discussion or conversation or answering questions as an in-class activity. This is specifically stuff that is a little weird off the beaten path that you get up and have to do. For me, I say that there were instances, again, in that cell biology class that I TA'd for, where this was used to great effect in my estimation. But there are other cases where I felt as a student that I really didn't get anything out of it, and the time it took kind of felt too long for the amount of unit information. So I'm kind of like in between a B and a C here, where it can be pretty good. It can also be kind of a waste of time. It creates social anxiety for me. Yeah, it's like kind of like weird and uncomfortable, but it's okay to be uncomfortable. Getting out of your comfort zone is still useful. It's just unlike discussion where you're like learning how to communicate. In-class activities are just like, you know, I don't know. I find that they're not quite as useful for me. In-class activities can help a lot in building relationships in the classroom, but they're not best for learning itself. Yeah, maybe I'll put it in B. You make a good point that like getting students, especially very introverted students, out of their comfort zone and maybe even doing something a little silly could be beneficial for them. That does make sense. We did Kahoots in a lecture so the professor could tell how much we understood. That's actually like a version of the clicker, I guess a more modern version of the clicker that we have. And I think that's actually quite good. Using digital media in that context to evaluate understanding is quite good for the lecturer. Would class-wide learning games like Kahoot fall under the category of in-class activities? I've actually forgotten that Kahoot exists as a possibility, so I will definitely put Kahoot as a B. Like, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. I like that. I like that. In-class activities have use cases in elementary and middle school. That is also very true. I'm more focused on the undergraduate experience. What is the clicker? Oh, are clickers outdated? Oh, no. So back in my day, before smartphones were as ubiquitous as they are now, we had things that we had to buy for class that was basically a laser pointer with A, B, C, and D on it. And you could synchronize it with the presentation so that you could take quizzes in the class by just clicking A, B, C, or D. I'm sure that's been replaced by smartphones by now, though. Okay. Next up, this is one of my favorite techniques, although this one is also somewhat controversial. That is Socratic questioning. So, chat, do we know what Socratic questioning is? Or what the Socratic method is? Who knows what the Socratic method is? Is this a term that we are familiar with? The Socratic method / Socratic questioning. It's what you're doing right now. Yeah. Riddle, I'll get to your comment in a bit because I think that's interesting. But I'm talking about Socratic questioning now. I do, but I won't tell. Oh, very, very, very coy, very cheeky. So, the Socratic dialogue is a method of knowledge investigation, I would say, where it involves two people having a dialogue. So, one person asks a question, one person answers, returns with another question. You go back and forth, and that deepens both of your understandings. Socratic questioning is a technique where if a student asks you a question, you reply with a question. And so this can be very, very annoying for students. And I think it's important that this is done well, because Socratic questioning can be used to interrogate a student's understanding of Bloom's taxonomy. So say, for example, I had a student that didn't understand what it meant for RNA to be downregulated. Which to me was somewhat surprising. So, in order to understand why the student didn't understand this concept, I asked, okay, do we understand what I mean by downregulation? To sort of check if, like, which parts of their understanding was correct or intact or not correct or broken. And that method of replying questions with questions is a diagnostic tool. It also helps your students from taking advantage of you, right? Like, there are a lot of pre-med, for lack of a better classification, students who just want the right answer. And this kind of gets into what Riddle is saying about students with the attitude of, you are standing between me and my career, who just want to wrestle the answer out of you so that they can get a higher number. And I don't blame them. You know, everyone has different reasons for taking the classes that they need to take. But in order for you to not look like a pushover that will answer every question that is given to you, this causes some cost, some sort of discomfort when it comes to answering questions. Not enough. It's important to not make it enough that students stop asking you questions. That's why it's important that when students ask me this kind of stuff, I preface it by saying, I am going to answer you with questions so that I understand sort of at what level we need to talk about the subject. That just helps me give you an appropriate answer. So you make it a little it makes it a little expensive for them to muster the courage to ask you questions, but then it also filters the really dumb questions that you can. There are no dumb questions. There are questions that are dumb in the way that, you know, if you had just done the reading, like the very basic stuff, the very basic reading, then you would be able to recognize the correct answer at the very least. If you just show up and have students who don't go to lecture and expect you to give them the answers, this is a way to not give in to that, right? So it's a protective method for the teacher to prevent students from walking all over you demanding answers when they've done no work, but it's also a way for you to troubleshoot their understanding. And for that reason, I put Socratic questioning. It does have drawbacks. You can do it incorrectly. You can make students very uncomfortable and they can get quite annoyed with you. But I think that oh my goodness. I think that it deserves at least an A tier. At least an A tier. I tutor a lot, and my classmates often come to me with questions, and I often answer with another question to try to get them to figure it out on their own. Exactly. It makes it a little more active than just hearing the answer, which isn't very helpful for them. Okay. So I like Socratic questioning. Okay. Here's one that might trigger some of the younger audience members. This one is remote learning. Ooh, remote learning, not that long ago. Certainly, what I will say about remote learning is that by many studies and metrics, remote learning did not work. And so it would be very tempting to put remote learning in D tier immediately. But I want to come at this conversation with a bit more nuance, right? So, first of all, remote learning will be necessary given some big global event. So it's not useful to just say, oh, remote learning will never work. I take a more constructive approach by saying remote learning did not work, but could we make it work better if/when we have to use it once more. Worse than in person, but what were the other options? Exactly. So it came with a lot of challenges. It wasn't great for the students, and research shows that metrics like concentration, focus, negative emotion, those were harmed during our remote learning period in our lives. But let me make the argument for remote learning by renaming it asynchronous learning. Remote learning includes things like Zoom calls, which I think that's just really hard to make work. But I want to make the case for asynchronous modules as a form of remote learning, because something like an asynchronous module puts the power of learning into the hands of the students, which requires them, yes, to be more motivated to do the work, but also it has been shown to be effective for some of the best students in the world, medical students, right? There are entire medical schools that rely almost entirely in their first year on the option to have asynchronous modules. So some medical schools don't require their medical students to come to their first year lectures, and a lot of those medical students do as well as their peers. For some people, you might need to show up to lecture to improve, but there's something there, right? There's something that can work for a subset of students. And I think it would be worthwhile trying to figure out how we could make that model of learning better for everybody. Which is why I am going to put remote learning in C tier. Like, there's a part of me that really wants to figure out what about it works in the medical school context that we can try to adapt in case we need to pull out remote learning in the future. I think it didn't work because I felt like everyone had given up, including the teacher. Yeah, I think that that's not really remote learning's fault. It's like just the terrible situation we had found ourselves in, right? Like, let me be clear. I don't think that we should move to remote learning while things are good, but something like a worldwide pandemic can and probably will happen again. So to be defeatist about it and to put it in D tier, I don't think is a wise idea. I think by looking at the medical school context and try to take lessons from how they implement asynchronous learning, maybe next time we can approach the problem in a better way. It's bad. It was bad, but maybe it could be better. I am hopeful. Remote learning requires intrinsic motivation to learn. Without it, it won't work. That is true, but with that in mind, you can implement asynchronous modules in the form of homework. So designing activities to do at home that you can do on your own time that will walk you through how to do things in an active manner. That was something that I was piloting at my graduate school to try to teach in a very specific kind of context. I unfortunately left before that could become anything, but I was obsessed with this idea of using or adapting certain classes to a problem set focused approach where students had the option on their own time to do these problem sets for their classes that would walk them through how to do what they needed to do. I don't know how well it would have worked, but it was an option to try, as opposed to attempting to get students to pay attention in a Zoom call, which I think was going to always be difficult. I'm noticing in chat some self-derision, and you might be kind of new here, but I am very against self-derision, even in a joking manner, so do not talk down to yourself. If you came at the early parts of the stream, you would know that believing that you can't do something is often sufficient enough for you to not be able to do it. I'm so ambivalent on this because I can fare really well in some cases with asynchronous learning, but for others, if I don't have to come to class and start missing them, I can veer off really fast. It would be interesting to, we would have to really put in a lot of effort to make this work, but there has to be some sort of human aspect of this asynchronous approach too, where we structure the system in a way that can cultivate an intrinsic motivation, like maybe gamify it somehow. I don't know. I think there's potential. It's not my job to figure it out, but I think there is potential. Just make the teacher as a VTuber model. Yeah, man, that did happen. All right. Yeah, so hopefully you can see why I acknowledge remote learning isn't very good, but at the same time, it's not the worst thing ever. Okay, here's a teaching technique that I love, think, pair, share. So I learned about this technique as a undergraduate, and I've been using it religiously ever since. And so what this is you're up, you're doing your lecture, you're talking, and you ask the class a question. You first ask them to think about what the answer is alone in silence for 30 seconds to a minute. Then you get them to talk to their nearest neighbor and share what they have thought of, and then you ask them to share with the class, and then you can kind of collect different answers from different pairs. So this is an incredible tool, because if you've ever taught, you can know that depending on the students in the class, the mood can be quite frigid, right? A lot more cold and not active. And that kind of technique will allow participation from everybody to happen, because we've all been in classes where you just don't want to talk, right? You don't want to talk to the teacher, you don't want to talk to the other students, but by doing this technique, you actually in some ways force a little bit of active participation. Not only that, in a frigid classroom, you might have a case where there are students who would gladly tell you what the right answer is, but they're just like not confident, or they're kind of shy. And so think, pair, share, it doesn't baby them in the sense where, you don't develop the skills of learning to speak publicly, but it rather gives them a little buttress, a little support, right? A little support. And so by first telling their answer to a peer, they get a little confidence in case they're both in agreement in their answer. And that agreement will allow quieter students to actually share their thoughts and feel a part of the class, because there's a bit of research that shows that students that participate in class and have been enabled to say things out loud generally have more positive feelings about participation in the class, right? Once you break that seal of my voice matters, I'm intelligent, my thoughts and my thinking process are valued, that just makes the class a lot more worth it. Or again, classes where you don't feel worth, or you don't feel smart, or you don't feel like anybody cares, that's just not motivating. That's all. So think, pair, share. If you are thinking of teaching in any context, doesn't have to be a very formal context, but if you are teaching to more than a couple of people, I highly, highly recommend this technique. It's super, super useful. It's gotten me personally a lot of connection with students, connection amongst each other, and that forms stronger peer bonds, gets you that community. Use your fellow student as a resource to exploit. Yeah. Like inevitably there will be like slacker students who expect their partner to do all the work, but generally, if you're both feeling, in my experience, people in university are generally pretty good at being adults. Not great, they're in the process of learning to be adults, but if you're both asked to contribute to something as minor as answering a question, most people will at least try, so at least there'll be something productive. All right. So next item is cold calling. All right. Cold calling. So how many of you have experienced cold calling before? Let me define cold calling. Cold calling is when you're in a class and the teacher asks a question, and before people can shoot their hands up, the teacher calls on a student by name. How many of you have experienced that? And I want to hear from chat what your experience of that was like, how you felt about the teacher, how you felt about the class being cold called, and in what classes you've been cold called on. It never works. A non-primed person will freeze up. Social anxiety. What else? What other feelings do we have about cold call? Any other experiences with this? Cold calling makes my palms sweaty, mom spaghetti. Yeah. Yes. As long as I know the answer, I'm cool. Yeah. have never seen that. It would be horrible to be called on. It's not very popular, and it's getting less popular as the years go by. So I am mostly in agreement with you, chat, that cold calling makes me feel bad for doing it. It makes me feel bad as a student for getting cold called. And so I was ready to put cold calling in D because I've adopted think, pair, share, right? Like I already have my favorite method to garner participation and active learning. And cold calling, it just ain't it. It makes me feel bad. When I had to do it in graduate school, we had this like brilliant professor teach us introduction to cell and molecular biology. And he would get all of our names and shuffle them in an index card deck, and we would go line by line through a very difficult paper, and each one of us at random would have to explain a line or a figure in the data. And he would like roast us if we were wrong or if our ideas were dumb. And it was terrible. It was terrible. But it did have one benefit. It got me over the fear of being wrong because I'd been, crapped on. And I lived. So there is a niche for cold calling. It's actually surprising because when I was reading the literature on cold calling, I found a paper that showed that cold calling paradoxically improved the frequency by which a student participated in class. That once they were cold called, they were more likely to continue to participate. On average, again, for some people, they might freak out and never speak again, but on average, on the classroom-wide scale, cold calling was associated with a higher level of voluntary participation after the fact. And that, to me, was interesting. I don't remember enough about my undergraduate career to remember if that had been the case, but I do know that there were at least a couple of times where I had been cold called and gotten something wrong and wanted to prove myself, and so voluntarily participated again afterwards. And again, it's hard to believe, but that is what I read in the literature. It's pretty interesting, I think. Yeah. Last resort if there's no one engaged. My last resort would be think, pair, share, because that will generate, usually, somebody with an answer that has been supported by their classmate. I did that in OChem, and my teacher made us feel all dumb as hell. Sometimes I've had teachers kind of lose it and shame the entire class for not being able to answer, which can be an effective wake-up call if things are truly disastrous. But again, proactive effort can help us avoid having to draw upon our resilience. So ideally, we never want to be in that situation to begin with. Cold calling somehow helped me a lot during my master's. We had to read a paper on quorum sensing. Hey, quorum sensing, I love that. I love quorum sensing. And the teacher cold called us and let us explain it to the class on the board. Yeah, like cold calling definitely helped me too, because it forces you to come up with intelligent thoughts very, very, very quickly. It's not appropriate for every situation, but it's also not useless either. This seems also very teacher dependent. Yeah, if done with good intent and cautiously, then it's good. That is the context in which I am evaluating most of these concepts. All right. So I will put cold calling in C. So I was going to put it in D because I hate doing it and I would never do it. I still would never do it. I just don't believe that is in line with my teaching philosophy. But I will say it's surprisingly not useless from my perusal of the literature. Okay. Yeah, and you should never be shamed for not knowing the answer. Obviously, if I were to cold call, I would never shame. I would maybe redirect to a different student. Because the other thing is that once one student gets it wrong, there's one answer that has been eliminated, and sometimes students from there will be more confident in answering what they want to answer. Not always great, because it can kind of seem like students are sharks waiting for blood. And so once one fish goes down to swarm the blood and take the credit, which I've seen happen, with particularly, let's call them specially motivated students. But it doesn't always have to be that way. Okay, so that's the teaching meta. Now we're going to go into the study meta. The study meta. And I had been alluding to this idea this entire time, and that is active learning. Wait, what do you mean by specially motivated students? Students who maybe have a non-academic interest in answering after a student has answered wrong. So this is the study meta. So we've done the teaching meta. That's my side as a teacher. Now we're talking about the student side. Also, welcome, Mylan. Welcome to the stream. Mylan being a psychology VTuber. And since this is basically a psychology stream in disguise, I'm actually really glad that you've shown up so that you can check me on my work in case I am wrong. So what is active learning? Active learning is defined by doing something in order to learn, and that is very vague, but if you are proactively using your brain to learn, that's active learning. That's in contrast with something like passive learning, which is often something like listening in lecture or reading your notes, right? Those are passive. Doing stuff is active. And so I've got a couple of different examples, but just off the bat, what I do know is that the literature supports the idea that if you are actively learning something, if you are pouring your cognitive resources into working with complex ideas in one form or another, then that is generally better for you than doing it passively. So what are examples of active learning? Well, the first one I have up here is note-taking. So note-taking while you are in lecture is a very, very, very popular active learning strategy. In fact, it's so popular that it's like ridiculous. 96 or 98% of students report using note-taking as a learning strategy. But the fact that this is so high actually makes note-taking kind of a difficult concept to study, right? Because you can't ethically assign half the class, like you can't ethically ask one class to not take notes and another class to take notes and then compare their performance, right? That would be unethical. So the absolute effect size of note-taking, I think, is a little unclear. But what is true is that better students are probably likely also going to take notes, whether or not that is because they are better students or whether or not it makes them better students, not entirely clear. To me, note-taking, the function that it serves is not only to actively engage your body in the process of learning so that you're not just like zoning out of existence, but also to make special note in case the professor or the lecturer emphasizes something that it's going to be on the exam. So this is kind of a strategic method of learning. I think for me personally, with my low working memory, I just like don't have the memory to take notes. I will only write down what I think I'm going to need later instead of learning every single thing when I know that there's going to be a copy of the slides online, right? So your mileage may vary with note-taking, but it is active. It's probably useful. Some people is probably more useful than others. So I actually put note-taking in B tier, which might be controversial. It can help. It can be helpful. A lot of people do it. Good students do it. But it's not really sufficient or the most powerful thing I think you can do. Note-taking is more about forming a memory around the action of formatting the information onto text. Exactly, like the active learning process. Just more modalities, more engagement with the brain, better recall. Or just an experiment that mimics a class. That is true, although I haven't read any papers that are like that. Although, again, I read very broadly and skimmed abstracts and never really went into any depth. So I actually wonder if, but it's also difficult to say because I think note-taking is obviously good for a one-time informational recall experiment, but whether or not in the long term it is an effective learning strategy over the course of a class is more of my interest. Placebo class. I would love to take a placebo class. That'd be very funny. Drawing anatomy diagrams helped me a lot in remembering stuff. Yeah, note-taking is pretty good. I just think that it's overvalued as a strategy. I think it is overestimated in terms of its effectiveness, and people rely too heavily on feeling like they've studied because they took notes during exams, when in reality, note-taking is like the bare minimum that you should probably do in some form. Yeah. note-taking is a necessary evil. You concentrate too much in taking notes, you might miss half of what is being taught. Exactly. It's not very easy to make notes. Like, it takes skill to do so as well. What about auditing students, ones who are taking for no credit? I think auditing students are not a random sample, unfortunately. Students who are auditing classes, my impression is that they're likely to be better students to begin with. All right. Yeah, recopying verbatim is not wise. Yeah, that's right, Guy. If you try to summarize, summarization has been shown to be somewhat effective. Although, again, the effect size, from what I remember from my reading, not as high as you would think. Okay, so that's note-taking. What are other examples of active learning that we could potentially incorporate into our own practice of studying? So instead of relying too much on notes, what about read, recite, review? Ham has a question. What's your opinion on taking notes on paper versus laptop during a course? There's actually a paper that I didn't read, but there is a paper out there that exists that examines the benefits of laptop versus paper. And what they actually had found, was that I think the type of recall, the type of information recall was different. They were both good, but one helped you recall in a certain way through a certain mechanism than the other, and then the other one was better at the other way. And I don't know enough about psychology to tell you what the difference of those two were, but I think they are both pretty helpful. And of course, it depends on the class that you're taking. I think math, you're probably going to be better off with a pen and paper unless you remember how to do all of the Greek symbols on your keyboard by memory. Okay, so read, recite, review is a reading comprehension strategy that I believe was developed for K through 12, but I think has a role in undergraduate education as well. So you've taken the notes. My suggestion is that you don't read the notes again. I forgot to mention that in the evaluation of note-taking, but often the benefit of note-taking is the act of note-taking. Oftentimes, when you go back and you read your notes, they're actually not very useful. A, they're not complete because you can't capture all the pieces of information, and B, they're often not done with any level of intelligent forethought in terms of you're not going to be note-taking live with the design of reading it later because there's no way you can know what's about to come up, so you can't intelligently plan how to lay out your notes. So instead of reading your notes, you can read, recite, review the textbook or lecture material. Where you read, that's the passive part where you just like incorporate the information, and then you try to explain that information out loud, engaging more modalities where you have to actually say words and use your mouth and engage your different parts of your brain and actively recall the information without reading back. And then review, see if you got things right, see if you need to explain things in a different way. That has been shown to greatly improve. I shouldn't say greatly because I don't know what the effect size is, but it would be reasonable to believe that that has a pretty good effect on getting the grade that you want. So if note-taking is B, I put read, recite, review in A tier. All right. Okay, so what's next here? Okay, yeah. Reading notes is the next item. Yeah, I already kind of said this. Reading notes, I personally think this isn't great. I believe the research also suggests that this is a suboptimal way to use your time. D tier. Okay, now we come to a study technique that was mentioned earlier on in the stream, that is flashcards. So flashcards, I think this is very discipline dependent, right? Like, I don't think you would typically use flashcards for something like an English class, right? Before classes where flashcards are valuable, where the volume of information is very high, say biology, flashcards are a very, very good way, situationally excellent. This one I think is pretty unproblematically A tier. Again, for the application, it's not useful for every single class you might take, but for the classes where you need to just cram a bunch of information, like say you have to learn all 208 bones or whatever, flashcards, tried and true method, supported by scientific evidence. Yeah, flashcards seem to be optimized Read-write-review 2.0. Yeah, I think they're related, although flashcards, they helped me a lot with the GRE, learning all those big fancy adult vocabulary words. I didn't really use them for biology because I actually think that something else is better for biology, but for just cramming all the bones and, all of that, I think very, very useful. Okay. This one is a big one. This is one that I spend a lot of time thinking. Self-evaluation, self-testing. So this is related to flashcards. Self-testing is basically trying to recreate the exam environment by evaluating your own knowledge. So there are two layers to why potentially why self-testing is very good. So one is the learning aspect, so using self-examination as a tool to learn. So instead of like spending your time rereading notes or reading lecture, just make an exam for yourself. Ask yourself a bunch of questions, or if your class allows it, use a practice test and just do it and get things wrong and feel bad. And then through that process of struggle, you can actually find that is a very effective learning tool as you force yourself to be in that exam environment with the pressure, with the time, to force your brain to work to produce an answer, right or wrong. And then you review and you learn what the right answers actually are. Self-testing has a secondary bonus of a metacognitive tool. Self-testing points out what you're weak in, so you become more aware of what you need to then work on. So on two levels, self-testing is very, very effective as a study tool, especially if you have a class that gives you practice exams. Like, if your class allows for that and you're not taking those self-tests, you are just like not even trying. Like, I'm very opinionated on this. And erasing the answers from your homework can also be a method of administering a self-test. Making your own questions up is great. If you're learning languages, it's a great way to do language as well. So flashcards are certainly okay, I think, for language, but I think what's better is testing. More faithfully recreating the testing environment, I think, goes a little harder than flashcards. In my opinion, this is only great if you can self-mark / make sense of mark schemes. So you have access to the course material, so you should be able to accurately grade yourself based on what you are supposed to know. Look for old exams and see how cooked you are. Yeah, sometimes. I can't advocate officially for getting old exams because that could be outside of the policies of a given class. They might not be too happy that you've done that. It might also be doing you a disservice. But again, there's a meta to education getting a grade. So if they allow for that, you should definitely take advantage of that. How is self-testing compared to just doing practice problems? It's somewhat similar, although practice problems, because it kind of depends on how narrowly you define practice problems, because that certainly can mean the same thing. But, a practice exam really drives you from basic knowledge to mastery. And sometimes just doing problems might not be all the way up there, depending on the class, of course. All right. What do you think of taking tests on paper versus on the computer? I have no experience with studying that at any level. I took the GRE on a computer. I don't know. I don't really have an opinion on that. Okay. Next one, we have collaboration. Okay, so I've been harping on about establishing connections and a support network, and that's all very important. Collaboration can also be very helpful for studying, although I think I used to overvalue this. Now I think I've moved my ranking down a little bit in terms of the effectiveness of collaborative learning. And by this, I mean like study groups. I think if you need a study group, this is S tier. Unquestionably S tier. In my personal experience, I was unable to focus with other people around. I really needed to be disciplined and lock in. And I felt like I could get more out of my time by studying alone than studying with a partner. So that's why I can't in good conscience put this in S or A tier, but I think it's B tier from my personal experience. There were very few instances where I think that forming a group to study benefited me personally. But that doesn't mean it doesn't help other people. It's just that like there are risks and benefits to being in collaborative groups to learn. There is one exception, one aspect of collaboration that I think is not controversial and undervalued, if it can be undervalued, and that is teaching others. Okay. So I'm going to address Space's comment. Isn't read, recite, review a bad method because there isn't a lot of thinking involved and it's more like trying to remember something and spew it back literally? So read, recite, review is for reading comprehension in particular. And at the university level, there's often a lot of dense and difficult text to just understand. So it's a pretty good study method. It might not be perfect for getting all the way to higher level thought, but for getting in the door, I think read, recite, review is really good for just making sure you understand what it is that you are reading. So, teaching others is a evidence-supported method of study that has a very high correlation with better grades. It's some of the strongest correlations with grade point average. Now, again, is it because better students teach others, or is it because they are teaching others that they are better students? I find myself believing that as a technique, by forcing yourself, putting yourself on the spot, and forcing a coherent explanation, and again, practicing communication, because you can think that you have a good idea of what you're saying and how you are communicating an idea. And if someone has no idea what you're saying, it means A, you probably don't understand it as well as you think you do, and B, you won't be able to convince the professor that you understand it as well as you think you do. So teaching others is a very strong evidence-supported method of learning. So while getting together in a collaborative study group might not always be the most focused use of your time, taking the time to get into teaching is actually really good for your grade. I think teaching others is absolutely correct. It is good for everybody. Nobody doesn't benefit from the act of teaching others a subject that you then need to learn. Teaching others, S tier. During high school years, I don't know why people associated me with good math. I got asked math questions so much that I got an A for math. I think Pedagogy has strong opinion. I don't know if you've heard that, but Pedagogy is offering her thoughts as well. Yeah, like being relied upon. So I got an A in biochemistry, but I didn't feel like I actually learned anything because my professor was not the best at teaching. But because I got an A and I was one of the few students who had such a high grade in that class, I was able to TA for it. And I actually felt like the second time as I was teaching it, I was like, oh my God, okay, I get it now. Like I understand lock and key versus induced fit. Like I understand why the math looks this way. And while I was able to get the right answer the first time around, it was only the second time around when I was teaching it did I actually feel like I got it. So those are useful. Pros of being in med school. A lot of people gather material for you, like lectures, exams, and even summaries. Yeah, med school is its own unique teaching environment where I think if we adapted more of the medical style, it would be good for students who are intrinsically motivated and students who need that structure because it is highly structured. It's just, it's a lot. It can be a lot to learn that way. Definitely understood stats much more after teaching it, can confirm. Yeah, Mylan has a series, if you check out their YouTube channel, on learning stats from the ground up, which has been fun to kind of pop in and out of. Because as someone who has not really needed anything more complicated than a t-test, it was fun to just kind of see and relearn stats from the bottom up, and just to make sure that I really got it. Okay, next one. That I have up here is Pomodoro. This is kind of fun. So Pomodoro is a study technique where you have these timed sessions of focused productivity as well as timed breaks. I'm actually not too familiar with Pomodoro. I didn't use it as a student. I know that it was popular even back when I was in school, and it remains popular these days. And you can find VTubers like Cideray, who I don't think Cideray does Pomodoro anymore quite as often, but there was a period of time where she was doing Pomodoro quite often. I think she has a short where she explains the useful utility of Pomodoro. I myself have not gotten too deep into that literature, so if I had a question mark tier here, I would put it in question mark tier, but I kind of want to turn it to the audience because I feel like I'm in the minority of never having done Pomodoro. Chat, where would you put Pomodoro? Is this something that you are familiar with? Is it like the Feynman method? I'm not sure. Similar to the Harvard study method, 35 minutes of studying, then 5 minutes of doing something you want to do. Something like that. Yeah, like structuring work time with goof off time or relax time. At least A tier, but it depends on how much ADHD you have. That's kind of interesting. I wonder what you mean by that. From my experience, it helps keep pace with studying. Because like when I studied, I would like lock in and like hyperfixate for a while and then take a break whenever I felt like it. Like I didn't have a structured way of going or allocating my time. And I'm wondering if I would have done better if I had that structure. A solid B, it's quite helpful for procrastinators. Interesting. Yeah, if you want to get into Pomodoro, you can, or it's also known as like study with me. That's a very popular genre of video these days where you and the streamer just do work together and then the timer goes off and you can all chat and have fun. I've considered doing Pomodoro streams myself, but I don't know. I feel like I don't really do well with that structured level of enforced break time. So that's maybe why I never got into it. Scheduling blocks of time to do things is good for productivity and prevents distraction. That makes sense to me. My girlfriend would put that method in S tier as she uses it constantly. According to her, it helps with people with ADHD. That's interesting. So having that structured break time allows you maybe to release the pressure valve, if I'm interpreting that correctly. I started using it recently. It can get you to do work, but if/once you lock in, the enforced breaks are more of a limit than a boon. That's kind of my attitude as well. We do art streams where we sit in a pod and talk while we all work on our work we need to work on. Yeah, that ties in with collaboration too. It's just like a little bit of company might help when you do Pomodoro. Yeah. So what I'm hearing is that chat generally is a fan of this technique. And if you haven't used it or are not aware, you might want to look into it. Who knows? You might be a Pomodoro convert. So I'll go ahead and put it in A because it generally seems like people think it's a pretty useful method. Okay. We are getting to the end-ish. There are a couple more items on this list to go through. Yeah, okay. So here is another set of two. Spaced learning and the opposite of spaced learning, which is a concept called, oh, come on, Photoshop, masked repetition, otherwise known as, if you do it the night before, it's called cramming. So spaced learning is, as it suggests, a technique by which you space out your study sessions, that you don't consume all of the information that you need for an exam all in one go, but that you space it out and establish a habit versus doing everything all at once. Masked repetition is, of course, the exact opposite of that, where you do everything in one go and it's very stressful and it kind of sucks. So you can already tell where my bent is going to be. And of course, it should be no surprise that the research suggests that masked repetition is not an effective way for people to learn. Now, again, there's no F tier study method. You know, there's no method where you do it and it's better than doing nothing. Except interesting, one paper suggested that highlighting your notes is actually worse than not doing anything. I'm not going to get into that. I just kind of felt that was an interesting thing to skim. But It's not a surprise. Don't cram. Don't do it. It's something that all teachers say, but students do it anyway. And that's the whole thing of like metacognition is not sufficient. You actually have to be able to control and, address bad habits. Oh gosh, I lost the layer. Where is this one? Can I just do that? Okay, great. I can. Awesome. On the other hand, by spacing out your study sessions, you not only are going to be less anxious, but also you just end up being better at recalling things. So I put that in A tier, uncontroversially, I think. Last minute cramming is underrated. That's only because that's why it's not an F. It can work. It's better than not studying. But if we're comparing efficiency, I think it's not unusual to put it in D tier. And I say that not as like, oh, I was the perfect student and I spaced out all my learning. I didn't. I crammed through all of undergraduate and it was terrible. And it probably led to me having a very bad time and hurting my mental health to be constantly feeling on, scraping by the skin of my teeth. So I cannot recommend it. It's bad. Research says it's bad. Try not to if you can avoid it. What use is cramming if you're going to forget it all a week later? You would be surprised that... So we have this idea that everything you learn in college, if you've truly learned it, you just learn forever. And that if you forget everything a week later, it means it was useless. It's not. Say you crammed all the cell cycle, and it was really hard the first time you did it. And then a week later, you've forgotten anaphase and prophase and metaphase and all of that. Like, no biologist has an encyclopedic memory for everything that the cell does. And so it's not unusual, I think, to lose that recall shortly after an exam. But the idea is that when you need to learn the cell cycle again, it's going to take you way less time. Retrieval. I don't know if I'm using that word right, but the second time you learn it will be a lot easier. All right. There's some evidence that sleep is a vital thing for encoding things into long-term memory, so at least start studying the day before. We're going to get to that. It's one of the last items, and one that I am very passionate about. Okay. Another dichotomy within learning strategies is this idea of interleaving and blocked learning. Okay, so this is another dichotomy. Interleaving is when you mix up the topics that you're learning in order to create deeper connections between the concepts that you are learning. So evidence suggests that this style of learning improves performance. I don't have a lot of personal experience with interleaving studying, and it's not actually something that I knew about before I did research for this stream, so I can't in good conscience put this higher in B tier. It sounds useful. I've never done it myself, and if I update this tier list later, then maybe my opinion will change, but I do trust the research. It's just I don't have a lot of experience with it. I do want to acknowledge that it is there, though. And on the other end, blocking is when you learn, you study for the test in the order that the material was presented, and that typically doesn't do as well. So I'm just going to trust that it's probably C tier, but that's about as far as what I've read on that subject. All right. Okay, now we get to sleep. Oh, come on. Get to sleep. So this is another one of those things where we all know what the answer is here. You should sleep. You should. In fact, there's a lecture that a professor of mine used to give in my undergraduate where the whole talk was just about how valuable sleep was. And as Mylin has said, yes, sleep is very important for encoding memories. Your hippocampus will thank you. But there is a paper out there that compares the decision, because it's always a decision, of studying and not sleeping and sleeping. And in that decision matrix, again, it would be unethical to force a randomly grouped amount of students to cram and not sleep. You don't do random assignment for things that could potentially harm a study participant, but again, students who chose to sleep instead of cram end up doing quite a bit better because sleep is important for making memories, right? So do that, right? I'm proud to say that I've never pulled an all-nighter in undergraduate except for when I was having fun. I've never pulled an all-nighter for class. I've only pulled an all-nighter when I was having a lot of fun at a sleepover that ended up not being a sleepover. It was just talking about our feelings until the breakfast places opened up. And that was a lot of fun, and I felt like garbage the entire day, but that was great. I loved that, but I never did it for class. So this time I do practice what I preach. You should absolutely sleep. You need to do it. Your brain needs to do it. If you think you're going to do better by cramming, dude, you're already lost. Like, if you think you need to cram, then you already messed up. And there's no point in shortening your life just for the idea that you'll do better. Yeah, so that's S tier. Crammed an entire semester in 8 hours, aced the test. I'm not saying that cramming can't work. It's just not good. It's just not good. Me watching streams at 4:30 a.m. Hey, I'm not going to tell you how to live your life, but I will tell you that your hippocampus is not happy with you right now. All right. So let's go to the next one. And that is going to be... Oh, come on, Photoshop. We're watching videos. That's me. So, I have complex thoughts on the utility of video in education. And I think video serves the same purpose as lecture. It's more like a resource than it is a study tool. Because it's not very active. Like, if you're watching Khan Academy, you're watching it not because you need the upper level skills. You're watching Khan Academy because you need to get your foot in the door. And for that, I think it can be quite useful, right? Or Shomu's biology. Some people don't like Khan Academy, but Shomu's biology, every biologist out there is familiar with Shomu's biology. Step-by-step guide on every biology concept you can possibly think of. Is it entertaining? No. But Shomu does a great job in making sure that you have a video resource for things that you need to learn. In terms of my videos, you should not be watching my videos to study. My videos are for entertainment and to keep you engaged with the science. So watching videos, personally, I think it has its utility, but it's not like super amazing. And often you reach for it because you didn't get something the first time around. So it might be in between a B and an A for me, but since I don't want to do like half C's, and this tier list is as top heavy as it is, I'll put it in B tier. As this S tier, obviously. I cannot in good conscience, like morally, you know, as a meme, yes, my videos are S tier, you should watch them all the time, make your brain big, but morally, to make this an actual useful resource, watching videos can be useful, it's not sufficient nor necessary, but it is pretty good. And watching videos is a low motivational barrier compared to other techniques. Depends. I myself hate watching videos. I will only watch a video as a last minute resort because videos are slow. They are a slow way to learn in some cases. Okay. And last question, last item, I should say, on this tier list. And this is something that I'm very passionate about, is narrative. So I think that the reason why a lot of people drop biology is because you have to learn truly so much information before biology gets even a little bit interesting. Not every student has the intrinsic motivation to learn about cells. Some students love cells, right? They just like looking at cells under a dish and think that small things are cool. Love that, but not everybody that doesn't appeal to everybody. And so narrative is the framework that we can use to structure lessons that tell a story. And so stories are how humans have been learning for millennia. And it taps very deeply, I think, into our logical ability to understand a sequence of events. So if you just say, you know, prophase is this, and anaphase is this, and metaphase is this. You know, it's very dry. It's not very exciting. And only your most hardcore biology nerds will find the excitement within a story like that. Something that I like to narrate is glycolysis, right? The process by which a cell breaks down sugar for energy. And that is one of the most dry, step-heavy, volume-heavy concepts in all of biology. Just every step, you just have to know it as a biologist. It sucks, but you have to memorize it one time so you understand how it works. Where I think teachers can make glycolysis more exciting is by posing this question. So you might know the answer to this, chat, already, but think about how weird this answer is, right? It takes energy to make stuff. The cell is a unit of life that is constantly burning energy just to exist. So if everything on our green earth is burning energy, in our system, where does that energy come from? You can say it comes from sugar, it comes from burning sugar. But where does sugar come from? Right, so where does sugar come from? Where do we get energy from? The food you eat, yes, the food that you eat. But how does the food that we eat get there? The sun, exactly. It's kind of interesting because if you think of the Earth as a physical system, if we assume that Earth is closed and that all of the stuff that we need to survive is made here right on planet Earth, like Earth could never, or life could never happen, right? And it's maybe not like a revolutionary thought to be like, oh, the reason why we can burn energy is because the Earth is not a closed system, that the Earth has input in the form of energy from the sun. And glycolysis is the ability of us to harvest the sun's energies. And I think that's a little more of an interesting narrative because biology has the benefit of being the best story ever told. The story of how living organisms overcame tragedy. And I don't mean that in a fluffy way. I mean, evolution literally is the story of the survivors of eons of suffering and hardship. So every adaptation, or I should say most adaptations, because I'll get called out again, most adaptations are only here because they helped an organism in some way, shape, or form survive hardship. And so framing glycolysis not as this is the process that a cell uses to break down sugar, versus this is the process by which we have evolved to harvest energy from the sun. It's just a lot brighter, a lot more interesting, a lot more interconnected with biology as a whole. So yeah, I figured my chat would already know the answer, sun plus chlorophyll. And I think, at least for me and Clockwork, that was a uniquely poignant moment of realizing that we think of plants as being powered by the sun, but because plants are powered by the sun, we're also powered by the sun. What about using metaphors or personifications to explain concepts? I see that used very often in chemistry especially. So I haven't read the analogy metaphor literature, but I think that it depends on the level of your students, because they have to be able to recognize that metaphors are just metaphors and that there is complexity. So there's this phrase that my advisor, my PhD advisor, had drilled into my head, and that's all models are wrong, but all models are useful. So when you say that DNA is like a blueprint, that is true in many ways, but it's not true in all ways. And as long as you feel that students are mature enough to not take things that literally, analogy and metaphor can be very useful. Mnemonic devices can help. Yeah, there are a lot in biology, just because of the volume of information. I would rank analogy and metaphor as A tier. I'd rank mnemonic devices as A tier as well. Where would you put seminars? 60% of our classes had us making and presenting PowerPoints, and it was hell for me. Unfortunately, I would put that in S tier. The ability to do public speaking and to formulate intelligent thought and communicate intelligent thought is a very useful life skill, useful academic skill. also helps define your thought process, right? When you see professors who are very practiced in their ability to give a research talk, you can follow the story. I feel like I've never met a professor that wasn't great at telling a scientific story. I've met professors who are not good at teaching because those are two separate skill sets, but telling a story is almost always going to be beneficial for you, especially when it comes to selling yourself as someone desirable by a company or by a university. I had one professor who would always talk about electron density as giving his granddaughters concrete bags. Yeah, like metaphor and analogy allows you to put a little bit of yourself in some of what you teach as well, so it can be quite useful. Yeah, and humans like stories, exactly. So I put narrative in S tier. And that is actually the end of the stream in terms of what I have for you. I'll take a little bit of time to chat about what's already on here. If there are things that you all want to talk about, or if you have things to add to the list, we can talk about where I would place them out of the blue here. I'll chat for a little bit, maybe like another 5-10 minutes, and then we'll call it a stream. Yeah. How often do you stream? I stream roughly once a week. If you can't tell, I end up having to prepare like a lot for these. So I try to do one a week, but you know, life happens. And I'm also working basically every night when I get home after class. I like work on the microbiome video, and the progress is very slow because the video is very long. So I try to split my time between touching base with my audience, making sure that you hear from me, and also working on my more long-term goals, which would be to make this microbiome video. Just wanted to ask, how do you choose a good paper for a journal club? So what I do is I go to PLOS, which is an open access journal, and I'll troll Google Scholar as well, and I'll just type in a topic that I'm interested in. And first I'll see if they're open source so that I can share them on stream. And then if I find that the conclusion is either counterintuitive or fantastical, those are my favorite things to talk about. So things that go against what you may already know so that you can unlearn and update your knowledge, as well as things that are just unexpected in general. Like the idea, one of these days I will do the paper that shows that the microglia, the professional phagocyte of the brain, is involved in learning by chewing up your synapses. That's an unexpected thing. We think of learning as, at least in an introductory neuroscience class, you think of learning as the balance between long-term potentiation, LTP, and long-term depression, LTD. These are two modules of synaptic plasticity, just like neurons getting stronger / neurons getting weaker. And you learn about neurons communicating more through that lens of receptors and neurons getting louder or quieter, to make an analogy. But you don't often hear about neurons changing their signaling strength because of something that looks like an immune system cell, which is very, very interesting. Are all the other members of Ethereum on YouTube, and do you plan to let someone else join? So Nep and Sai are both on Twitch. Their stuff, their links are in the description of the stream, or it should be. Let me actually make a plug for my Discord now that we are at the end of the session. So let me go ahead and copy that. Give me a second while I get that link, so that if you want to continue these conversations, we can have them over in my Discord. There you go. What are my opinions on sites like Sci-Hub? So, Sci-Hub is the open repository for papers, right? I think that your tax dollars going into research means that all science should be open, but that's unfortunately not how capitalism works. So things like Sci-Hub I think are good for the public, but the incentive infrastructure of the publishing system, I think, is a little hard to address here. All right. I don't know how to feel about my synapses being nibbled on. I know, it's a little weird, isn't it? And I love papers that show how weird biology can be. So that's generally what I end up picking. And like, as someone who is like an amateur immunologist, an amateur microbiologist, I sometimes choose papers based on how cool the story ends up being. Like, when you learn about immunology when you're a kid, you learn about the viral life cycle, you learn maybe a little bit about what each cell does, but you don't learn everything. You don't learn about reactive oxygen species chemically reacting with bacteria and blowing them up. You don't learn about antimicrobial peptides and how they skewer bacteria and pop them open. Like, there's a lot of neat things that happen at the small scale. So sometimes it's more like intellectual, like, oh, I didn't know that, that's unexpected. Sometimes it's a little more immature, where I'm like, oh, dude, isn't it cool that like your cells make a thing that pops bacteria open? That's so cool. So that gives you a little insight into what I find to be interesting. Yeah, are there any experiences, positive or negative, that chat has had in school that you want to share? Because I think it'd be interesting if you have a particular teaching/learning experience that you want to share to have me react to. That'd be kind of interesting to do with the last few minutes of stream here. The complement system was cool to learn about. Exactly, like self-assembling complexes that destroy bacteria. The fact that those were able to be evolved at all was pretty amazing. Immunology has some of the best stories. Yes, absolutely. That's why I love learning about immunology, because if you want to see evolution in like 50x speed, like battles, you get evolutionary battles. Of course, they happen over time, but they are battles. And as a kid, I loved learning about things like war. I mean, obviously war is terrible, but in terms of stories of war, understanding conflicts, there's no better way to illustrate the conflict of evolution than immunology. So immunology has been a love of mine for a long time. Too much memorization for me personally, though. The thymus war dialing basically every protein for antibodies. Yeah, spoiling a little bit about the microbiome video that will come out hopefully maybe mid-October. Never picked up that the complement system existed in school biology, and was fascinated when I learned about it. Yeah, because a lot of early school stuff stops before things get cool. Honestly, I think I spend more time playing Uno in my school than any form of studying. I was just chatting to a friend who I reconnected with, who said that he had been cutting class to play poker, which you shouldn't do, but in that case, he was actually practicing his mathematical reasoning skills and became like a Google tech guy. So I say GPA is really important. It's certainly not required for a high achieving good job, but it doesn't hurt, and oftentimes it will help. So I think there's a narrative going around that like, oh, nobody cares about your GPA once you graduate. Yeah, no one cares once you've been working for a while, but that first job can be easier to get with a higher GPA. I participated on a talk about tuberculosis where the bacteria rose from the dead due to resurrection promoting factors. That's interesting. I'm wondering what that technically looks like. How do we make ToxCat work? Oh, you have to be a member. So if you subscribe to my channel, join membership for $1, you get access to all the emotes. I will ToxCat for you in the meantime. Bang. What is GPA anyway? Grade point average, the number that you get on your report card. I don't know what they call it in Europe. I think watching videos contributed a lot to me understanding stuff like ECGs, because it has a lot to do with stuff with third aspect rather, 3D aspect rather than a 2D aspect that a textbook provides. Yeah, for things that require rotation, like organic chemistry, yeah, video can be quite helpful there. That is true. Oh, on the Discord. I mean, everybody should be able to use emotes on the Discord, so it should be up if you've read the rules and have followed the instructions. So I'm not entirely sure what's going on there. Germany is an arbiter system. I'm not entirely sure what that means. ABITUR. Yeah, I don't know what that is. That's interesting. I'm not sure if there is one where I am, just individual grades. Oh, so a GPA is sort of the average of all of your class scores, an overall evaluation of your grades. All right. My voice is getting a little hoarse. I've drank all the water that I've prepared for myself, and it is getting later in the day. I hope for the students in the class, in the class, I really try to avoid calling my streams classes because they're not. For all the students who are in chat, I hope you have a good semester coming up. I hope that maybe some of this was useful for you, and for people who are out of school, I hope some of this was at least interesting from a theoretical point of view. Maybe provide some justification and validation of your experiences in school. I don't know what I'm going to be doing in the next week, but I know that I will be working very hard on the microbiome video. I really think it's going to be a banger. I don't know if the algorithm will agree, but I'm having a lot of fun making that video. Oh my gosh, that's Perkinji yelling at me to feed her. Is Carlbot still disabled? Oh no, yes, Carlbot is still disabled, and Carlbot handles the rule react stuff. So I will look at who joined, and I will automatically assign the rules. Yeah, so Carlbot had a vulnerability that had to get patched relatively recently, so I've removed Carlbot, but Carlbot also moderates the Discord, so I will make sure shortly after the stream sometime today to make sure that you all get the rules that you're supposed to, so keep an eye out on that. Okay. Yes, good luck to all of you. I hope you have a good time in school. I hope you do a lot of good learning and you reach all of your educational goals, and I hope you stick around for whatever it is that I do next week and watch all the videos and all that good stuff. That will say bye, y'all. Goodbye.